Oh, look at that guy. Oh, he's got the guitars in the background. He said he's on the Dave Matthews Band concert. How you doing, Javier Rivera?
Pretty good, pretty good.
Oh,
Yeah,
good.
there's some things I want to talk to you about.
Beautiful. Beautiful. What would you like to talk about on this fine day, Mr. Rivera?
So I've been reading Freud again,
Nice, nice.
and I'll be curious. I mean, I finished What is Sex by Lenka Supancic, and so I'm
And
returning back to
you're
Freud.
taking all the crazy texts on. Look at you, Javier. Good
Yeah, so
times.
I finished What is Sex by Supancic, and I've read, I finished some parts of the Beyond the Pleasure Principle.
Mm.
And then I'm going through Freud's outline of psychoanalysis. And here's something interesting that I want to point out is that when he calls, for example, homosexuality a perversion, it doesn't actually make any sense for a couple of reasons. And it's based on Freud's principles, which is the tensions between the death drive and the libido drive. Um, Now, Freud kind of claims that the ego is the seat for the libido. So it means that the ego is the one that is parsing out, doing the negotiation for the libido. It is distributing, which is really interesting, right? That's what's doing the negotiating. But if per, per Freud's phases of sexuality, um, he calls, what he calls perversions is a kind of maldistribution of the libido. But this actually doesn't make any sense, precisely because the libido, if it aims at self-preservation, if that's what the ego is occupied with, doesn't it also mean that self-preservation is also destructive? Meaning that it cannot possibly make sense that every sexual aim is to be for the function of the genital organs, because that would actually lead to overpopulation. If everybody wanted to reproduce, it could lead to the over-exaggeration of the death drive side and lead to an overpopulation. So that means that there must be some, and Freud admits this, right, that the libido aims at neutralizing the death drive. So that means that the distribution of the libido is precisely what allows us to get difference. Now the question is difference was what it was supposed to be called versus a perversion? And the other thing is, if the ego is fundamentally what is trying to go for what is pleasurable and what is and reduce what is displeasurable, then from ego to ego, what we have is that there might be moments of displeasurableness from another ego, precisely because an ego disagrees with their own distribution of the libido itself, right? It's sort of unpleasurable because it's different. It's not the same distribution of the libido. Um, so it's interesting that we can even assert something what like Freud was originally saying, something like a disorder or a kind of um, pathology of the libido, precisely because it's the ego that distributes it. And I think that just kind of makes it problematic, because then I think the repercussions of this is that, is there really an Oedipus complex in the Freudian sense? Um, Precisely because of this just distribution of the ego, I mean, of the libido. Um, because if really in reality there's only the death drive, and if the death drive is to be actually purely destructive, it must destroy itself, and that's why we get the libido drive, negation of the negation. But self-preservation itself is also destructive. So whatever we constitute as normalcy can only be seen as a kind of um, perhaps a sort of certain quantum of distribution of libido, basically. Like that just so happens to be the normalcy is the quantitative distribution of libido, which most people would have. Versus abnormality, what we would define as normality, is the sort of differentiation of different distributions of the libido. But does that necessarily entail that that is a perversion? Does that necessarily entail that that's a disorder? And so when we go back to the Oedipus complex, I'm having a hard time actually believing there's a sense of normal development in a sense. It would have to be, what would have to be normal development would have been actually what the ego would have wanted to reconcile and failed to distribute properly for itself, right? So it wouldn't be any sense that there's a universal Oedipus complex. It would be a particular complex that the ego wanted. The question is, what did the ego want to distribute properly that it was unable to? And so in this sense, we go from a universal to a very particular thing. So perversions wouldn't be perversions universal. It would be, what was it that the ego wanted to negotiate that failed to negotiate? And this is what would constitute as difference. But in a difference that was not wanted from the ego itself, maybe. I don't know. I've said a lot. There's a lot to
It's
unpack there.
fascinating. A few things covered. First off, everyone, it is wonderful to see you today. It's a pleasure, Michael. I enjoyed your conversation, and the harpist does make beautiful music, and it was wonderful. Michelle's from South Africa, so that was all quite beautiful. So we have connections over there. I think you said a lot. I'll give it to Dimitri, and Dimitri, it's good to see you, sir. I think, some of the first things that come to mind is, there's questions of economic motivations. There's questions of, something we emphasize all the time that I love from just our days in literature is irony. And that we like to say that irony is the fabric of reality, and that a key characteristics of irony. And I don't think it's by chance, like someone like a Harold Bloom, who becomes the great literary critic of irony, is very interested in people like Freud and very interested in psychoanalysis. Now, whether he gets all the details right or not is a different matter. But there is this kind of idea of the very things we think are going to lead to self-preservation actually lead to self-destruction. The things that are actually good for us are not. And when we start talking about something as being life-affirming or a death drive, there is a certain notion that sometimes, ironically, they end up being the same thing at different scales, right? Because there's also the idea, Mr. Jockin, good to see you, sir. There's also the notions of I like that kind of way that you were putting it. That's very interesting on this kind of distribution of the ego into the life drive. And because right there, the moment you talk about distribution, and I'm just thinking of different things here. There are choices. There are questions of how to distribute. Do you have perfect knowledge? Because I always think economics is interesting to bring in. Do you have perfect knowledge? Are you always working on imperfect knowledge? Well, then the kind of assessment you make on how to distribute these things could actually prove to be ironic. And as you know, I've said a million times, I definitely think irony as being such a prevalent characteristic of the human beings. And you could really say, I do really agree with Harold Bloom on saying that one of the great gifts of great literature is showing us how much of human life is defined by irony. And what irony is not merely an unfortunate situation. Irony is where X does Y for Z, and Y is precisely why X doesn't get Z. How is that freaking possible? How can X so genuinely do Y, believing that's how they're going to get Z, and that's precisely why they do not? Well, because we're really bad at judging what is good for us and what is not. We're really bad at figuring out how things are going to unfold, how to distribute different things. And yet the question becomes, if we take kind of, I guess, and then I'll give it to Dimitri, is like there are questions of what are the starting positions, if you will, the starting drives or the starting desires, which gets going our decision-making process that can end up in these various ironies, right? Like we have to start with some sort of thrust, the various anal, the different drives that we have that then lead us in trying to assess or figure out the best way to organize those things together or have them negotiate. And that actually ultimately very often leads to various forms of irony. Like you were making the example of population. If we did the things that, well, then on that, I'm throwing out a lot here, that gets me into things like game theory, where if everyone does what is individually beneficial for them, you actually make it a situation where everyone dies, right? So is that really self-preservation? Well, on the individual level, yes, but on the collective level, maybe not. And this is where game theory is important, because it's the question, how can, if everyone does what is rational, you get a suboptimal result, right? A result that's not good for anyone. Well, that doesn't make any sense. How do we do that, right? So there are all these ironies that are very interesting that I think come up, that when we take seriously some of the thinking of psychoanalysis, these ironies start rearing their head. And then the question becomes, what's the proper response to these ironies, of course? If we're the ones who create the ironies, how can we possibly get out of the ironies? Isn't that ironic? You know, it just goes on and on. But let me pass it to Mr. Dimitri. Dimitri, it's good to see you, sir. I hope you are doing well.
No, great to be at the net again after the last week. Yeah, Javier, I've also been, thinking about psychoanalysis like I do often. And your thing about I want to say two things about this to you. The thing about perversion, it is that it's defined as it's a deviation from normalcy, right? So if it's not sex for reproductive reasons, it's perverted. But then you could come around and say, well, that's also contingent. Why would it have to be for reproduction that it's not perverted? Maybe that that is its own kind of perversion. And I think that would be accurate, but indeed, because of our social context, we have like quilted reproductive sex as non-perverted, and in relation to that, everything else is basically perverted. But it could be something else. But I think it's accurate in Freud's era. And whenever, like, Freud says normal subjectivity, normal persons, normalcy, I don't think he is that naive to think there's actually normal people out there. I think he always wants to make a standard just so you can see how it's actually subverted by the psychopathologies, and how these psychopathologies show more truth about that normalcy or about the psyche than would be the case if we would just say either there's just normalcy and we have to study normal ego to get all the pathological people up to normalcy, or to say everyone's crazy, which also doesn't work. Now, I think that's Freud's method. That's something he's been trying to play with. Now, in regards to what you refer to as the ego distributing the libido, I think this is a very interesting and tricky idea, because something I've been thinking about while reading Lacan, especially as of late, is the question of agency. Now, it would be too the ego is the agency, right? Like Freud's whole lesson, he would himself say, is that the ego is decentered. It thinks it's the center of the universe, the center of the world. It thinks it's in power, but actually it's a frustration, it's impotence, it's anxiety. This is where the real truth of the ego come to the fore. Now that leaves us with the question, but what is the agency? Because beyond me feeling or not feeling agency in my life, our entire political systems are based on the idea of free will, individual responsibility, being accountable for your actions. And I'm tempted to say, I don't know if this is right, but I'm tempted to say that in psychoanalysis, Lacanian psychoanalysis, only the signifier has agency. So it's, or the concept maybe in a Hegelian way, like has agency. It's not, and then we can retranslate this as like spirit has the agency, which is, it's the I that is a we and a we that is an I, and that is like, in a way, our very participation in God, as God, where the agency lies. But besides that, beyond that, apart from that, we have no agency. Now, I would be very interested to hear how, Javier, you would tackle the question of agency, and also Daniel, what would you have to say about agency, and like what would a Christian answer to it be, or something like this?
Oh, that's outstanding. And one of the things I was going to say, I really appreciate what you were saying. I'll give it to Philip, Mr. Luber, and then Michael. One of the things I sometimes think when I read normal or norm in classic texts, and this may apply with Freud, is sometimes I just think, oh, they mean the average. Like what has happened is norm can mean essence, the moral essence. What is the right way to do things? And sometimes I think norm just means what is the average. well, the average is X. Maybe it's a bad average, maybe it's a good average, but the average is that you will see, a certain behavior, right? Maybe that's good, maybe that's bad. And then of course there's the problem where if you have no average at all, then you have a society that struggles to function because every interaction has to be renegotiated on its unique terms, and it becomes too overwhelming to socially interact. And as a result, the society falls apart, right? So if there's no average, if you can't assume that in every interaction, there's an average of 60% shared language, shared ideas, and so on and so forth, it becomes too difficult to interact at all, right? But here's the problem, of course, that could oppress people, or that 60% could limit people, right? So there's this need to renegotiate. But it's interesting, that question on agency is huge. The first thing I would say is if you're not able to escape the norm, there's a question of agency. But also, if you can't handle the norm, there's a question of agency. Like if the norm is something you can't handle and you don't know how to work with or interact with, there's a question of if you can develop agency, which when I think of agency, I'm thinking there too kind of just social interaction, not merely I'm in this room and I can pick up the cup. I'm thinking agency in a social environment. If you are not able to work with the norm, there's a problem. But also if you're captured by the norm, there's a problem. And I think that has a lot to do with the signifier. Like if you can move with the signifiers or not. I think it's an excellent, I'll say more, but let me first give it to Philip here. Philip, it is good to see you, sir.
Howdy, Cowboys. Thank you. Yeah, I think when it comes to agency, just like knowing we need some kind of like hero myth to get over our death anxiety, like even to get out of bed in the morning, I think we really take for granted how important the communal story for us to deal with our existential position of both simultaneously being afraid of life and death. And I think, Daniel, I think what's like maybe most ironic is like, I think you would be more successful if you weren't a philosopher, but if you made like a belonging drink. I've been going out drinking a lot, and it like really brings people together, man. I'll tell you what, they love to ask people what they're drinking. Be like, hey, is that a Mike's Hard? But if someone was like, yo, this is a belonging, and they're like, oh, I got the again or the again, they'd be like, really? Bro, you and I like are drinking the same thing? This is awesome. How do you feel about your impending doom? And I think like one of the things where I'm gonna push back against objet little a because I've been thinking about the creed, and I have come up with like a neologism objet double D's. Because some people about that little a, some people about those double D's. And I think all this has to do with the amount of energy a person uses in order to make their hero myth a reality. I think this is what gives a lot of people agency. They can see both an internal self-stimulating, self-turning wheel, as Garn puts it. There's also something pulling them. There's just something teleological. And I think the big question, and I wonder if this is going to be like the giant irony of the coming years, is like we as innovative primates have pilfered the existing energy on Earth, and we may have a chance through innovation to create a source that's like star-like and potentially unending. Anyway, this is Alexander Barr's wet dream. I'll sign off.
So that's what we have to serve at the bar, the belonging. We'll have hard belonging, light belonging again. I mean, we'll have it on the porch. We'll all gather.
Yeah, but it's all like a Space Jam. It's all like that Michael Jordan drink. It's like a placebo. They're just drinking water, but they're like, man, I really feel it.
This is the way.
It's been a while.
Well, yeah, but if in order to find belonging, you had to require on it having an external taste versus be water, and you just accept and integrate with what determination is before you, would it really be belonging again, or would it be requirement on some sort of social average that you can't find agency in? So it's really important to actually do that. But I'll pass it to Mr. Luber, Michael, and Javier here. Mr. Ebert, good to see you. I hope you are well. I'm terribly sorry with the studio fire. That is terrible, but I hope you're doing okay. And actually, I've been thinking a lot on the stoop with Kaufman, non-locality fundamental that may lead to Terence Deacon on constraint creating order, which would possibly would lead into like freak theory, and then also Holgate. So I've been thinking cosmology recently, but on what was being said, I think also with this idea of signifier and agency, I'll throw in quickly. I have been writing recently a lot on a thinker I came upon many years ago who I always really like and always kind of put him together with Kurt Gödel and Leibniz. And I've mentioned him last week, Alfred Korbowski, who wrote a fascinating book, Science and Sanity, who is in the symbiotic world. It can also go with the psychoanalysis, and he's definitely responding to people like Freud. And one of the things he points out is that literally, if you have the wrong signifier to deal with a phenomenon, you will go insane. Like, it will actually lead to madness. And the example I always make is if you were trying to do modern physics with Roman numerals, then you literally couldn't do it because the signifier, the signs would not allow the thinking of what you're presented with, right? And so what he was saying, he goes to war against identification. A is a logic. Basically, he wants to sublate it because he says that there is no identification in reality. Things are always, well, passing over into otherness. They have the freak theory structure, their situations, right? And if you're trying to think the modern world with the wrong signifiers, you go mad. But of course, how do you think that you're in the wrong signifiers if you're stuck in the wrong signifiers to think them, right? That's always the comical joke, right? And don't you only have those signifiers to realize that you're in the wrong signifiers, right? There's something about agency that is the capacity to not be bound to a signifier, but also not scared to use a signifier. Because there's something interesting with that, right? If you're like, oh, I'm scared to use Roman numerals because what if I forget how to use non-Roman numerals? What if I get something wrong? You know, you have to be able to move in and out to have agency. And also, if you're afraid of irony, then that might actually, what you fear is what comes unto you. That might actually lead into various ironies. So there's something about agency that I do think is tied to courage and the capacity to know you need signifiers, you could even say an average, if that's a better word than the norm, but you also have to have the tact or the skill to determine when to move, right? Or else, basically, for Korbowski, what's so interesting, that very capacity to quilt, requilt, move beyond, et cetera, so forth, is the science of sanity. That is the science of sanity. That, like, by science, rigorous study, like learning how to do that is the key to sanity. If you cannot do that, you're screwed. So Korbowski is quite fascinating. It also makes me think of the great Michel Planier, but let me give it to Mr. Luber, then Michael and Javier. Mr. Luber, I hope you're doing well today, sir.
I'm doing pretty good. My brother actually just came over. This is my younger brother, Corey.
Hello, Andrew Luber's brother. It is good to see you.
He says it's good to see you. And yeah, Ebert, the fire, that's crazy. I'm sorry about that. Literally insane. But very good things that are being brought up right now. Couple things. My take on when I read normal, I see it as purposive. When someone says what's normal, they're orienting a subject in terms of what its purpose is. So it's like, this is the normal thing to do here. So that means that's the purpose of it. You're kind of giving a purpose to a subject by placing its value in terms of the medium, the average, what Daniel's saying. So it's like, if the average person's doing this, what this is being described, like the purpose of that is being described through what is normal. Otherwise, it becomes confusing what the purpose is. So I think it's when people are talking about, you know, life or just these complex things, it's very easy to ground stuff when you say normal because it subsumes so much. It has this purposive element, it has the subject element with it as well. So yeah, I just wanted to comment on that. Yeah, normal is purposive. The other thing with agency, let me see, I took a little note. Yeah, so like for me, agency, because like I always wonder, does my dog, like I always think about it all the time now. It's like, do you love me, or are you just like Like, is this love? Like, what is going on here? Like, I know I love you, but is that even love? Like, is it just because it's like you provide like some kind of emotional comfort after like a loss of a loved one kind of thing? Like, I don't even like, I'm not even sure what's going on. Right. That's funny, Daniel. But I just think for me, um, agency, and I can elaborate more, but I'll try not to. Agency is that which can be removed from an operation. So if you can remove, so like just because I know Javier's reading Badiou and set theory and stuff, like if you can remove a variable in a set, that's agency right there. Like the removal of something in a set or within an operation. If you can reconfigure or reapproach an operation, that's agency. So like the ultimate form of that is in life. It's like I want to reapproach life, and the ultimate way of showing that is, in a certain sense, killing yourself, like suicide. You know, like I'm taking a completely different approach to life, and I'm removing the variable in which life exists, like the set in which life exists, basically. Not to get depressing, sorry, Corey. But like, yeah, I think that to me is what agency is. I and then regarding irony, and like I'm not a Hegelian, and I know there's Hegelians here, so like please like push back or whatnot. But to me, like Heidegger's project, he's trying to get past irony, like how to think in a way that's not strictly ironic. And in that sense, to me, what he's trying to show is that true rationality, in a certain sense, is the ability to remove yourself from a dialectic, from a short circuit, and like being able to think through, not necessarily like the removal. I'm just using that to get the sentiment across, but it's like to bring up like the clearing. That's like a clever way of like revealing a dialectic. And in that sense, he's like trying to have an approach to being that's not strictly dialectic. So like in storytelling, like it's very obvious, like a lot of writers will get into like a short circuit with their story, and like they're really only thinking through the short circuit. And then when it gets to the end of the story, it kind of lacks in an ending because they really don't know what they're saying because they're just so caught up in a short circuit. And where if you're able to think beyond just your particular short circuit, if you're able to situate your short circuit in something that is beyond just that short circuit, and it can provide a home for other short circuits, then you can really like craft an ending to something, in my opinion. Like at my dog, like when I'm training my dog, like he's in a short, like I'm trying to get him kind of over like almost like a dialectic of sorts. Like it's like sit, here's the treat. If he's not sitting, he thinks he's gonna get the treat if he like jumps on me. So it's like, oh, if I'm more direct, I want the treat, so I should just go for it. So like going for the treat, actually for him, ironically, he won't get the treat. So it takes time for him to like, in a certain sense, like break out of that and then get into a short circuit. I don't think he ever gets into a place where he can literally remove himself from the short circuit. He kind of just moves from short circuit to a different short circuit. So like in a certain sense, I don't think my dog has agency. I definitely don't. I think he has sensations, but you know, just feeling isn't agency. So yeah, I've kind of jumped all over the place per usual, but it's tough. There's so many things that are said, and it's just beautiful. So yeah, thank you.
You're beautiful. And is your dog now trying to get away with you and crying? Because that would, yeah, agency right there. I see the sadness all over its fur. It's like, fine, fine. I don't have agency. It's fine. It's totally cool. I'll pass it to Michael, Javier, and then Mr. Ebert. Well, a few things come to mind. I definitely think this notion of kind of agency, constraint, takeaway, It's very interesting as well, because there is the question of what is agency found in? You know, is it the increase of options? You have more choices you can make. Is agency found in staying alive, so on and so forth? Me personally, I think about agency as really something that comes out in the surprise. And I know I've spoken to Mr. Ebert about this. Ivan Illich talks about the man on the side of the road. It's very interesting. And the reason why I like surprise, encounter as the emphasis, is because you can only have surprise if you have a normal, an average, so that you can have a surprise. You need the libido to distribute things enough that there's enough stability so something can occur that you're not ready for. Well, that seems screwed up. I was speaking to Michael Allison about the idea kind of with David Hume, and I think it's very important that the point of the reason why, like, let me just put it this way. We tend to associate the natural law with the most real, but the natural law is simply the precondition for the surprise, the miracle, if you will, the thing that cannot be expected. And the question is, how do you respond to that? Are you ready for the man on the side of the road? Because there's always this question, like, there's this emphasis in 20th century philosophy on the other, the face, the difference, the one you're open to. Well, to me, and we were speaking with Ebert, and the other that is truly other is the one that surprises you. If you predict the other, if you choose the other, it may be different. You know, you can make all sort of differences in how you say this, you know, other, different, so on and so forth. But the other that's truly other, and thus becomes the kind of invitation, is the surprise, which then, of course, you have to think about because it's an error going to the Frisk thing. There's an error, and agency is found in your capacity to respond to that. And yet it's very weird because it precisely feels like you don't have agency, doesn't it? Look, the world can surprise you. Something can occur that makes it seem like you don't have control, right? So what's interesting is that in the surprise, there's a testament to a lack of agency that is precisely the opportunity for agency. We were talking with Jockin on the example of the band, you going into the bar, the error as a kind of grace. And I definitely think agency is found in that, but this also might be why irony is such a characteristic of human experience, because you're creating an average in order to have a meaningful disruption of that average, which is ironic, but it's an irony that is a grace if you can respond to it in a way that rightly addresses it. So there's a certain creating a norm, so precisely as a kind of constraint on yourself, as a restriction. I'm going to make a norm, I'm going to make an average precisely so that there is a meaningful excess, a meaningful thing I cannot calculate in the schema, so I have an opportunity to develop agency in the response to that very thing, right? And I think that to me starts getting at, and then what's interesting about that is when we think about agency and the surprise, there are things you want to work really hard at to have certain skills that you don't know how you're going to use. So you're trying to create determination so that you're able to respond to something unpredictable. And I guess you could say what's interesting is that it's almost like the tension between the libido and kind of the death drive is that the surprise is what kills you. It could kill you. It could destroy you. And so the libido, for the sake of like developing agency, like it in its very effort to make sure you're alive or that there's intelligibility, thus creates a norm, must create the conditions of the surprise that then can kill you. Which, you know, the surprise would be overpopulation, to use that example. Or the surprise could be creating a norm that leads to a political backlash and fascism. Like, oh, there's the surprise. And so that the libido is playing, in a sense, a joke on itself. But in order for that joke to not destroy you, if you will, self-efface, actually be an opportunity for agency, you have to have that surprise to see how you develop. But let me give it to Michael and Javier. Michael, it is good to see you today, sir. I enjoyed our talk last week on adolescence. That was fun.
Yeah. Well, everyone had fantastic things to share, and I'm glad that catalyzed 3 hours of very rich discussion. I was thinking about when Andrew was talking about, you know, not thinking his dog has agency, which is true, but it's always like hard when, you know, you realize that your pets, like who you desperately want to, like, you know, resemble a human relationship, like actually don't. But I was thinking of like, okay, like does that mean that agency is not simply equivalent to action? Because like, you know, his dog or anyone's pet can, you know, if you throw a ball, it can go and fetch it, right? But is that agency, or is that like some kind of, you know, Pavlovian like conditioned, right, response to a certain stimulus? That's kind of in this short circuit of like, you know, if you throw the ball, it's always going to run towards it and it's always going to bring it back, or most of the time it'll bring it back. My dog would grab the ball and then just lay down and get tired. But that was like an interesting thing for me to think about, is like agency isn't just equivalent to like reactivity. And I think a lot of people think they have agency, or think other people have agency, because they're very active, or they do a lot of things, they're busy. But like, is that really agency? And I think what you're talking about is much more kind of this like stoic idea of like responding to the world, and controlling what you can control, and you know, like taking something that might, you know, produce this anxiety or this fear or this anger as like kind of this like top level stimulus response, and being able to like process that in a way and then go deeper than that, and like really hold the encounter and transform it into something. And yeah, and like, you know, I'm kind of, most of my thinking about agency is framed by this book by Agnes Callard called Aspiration, and the subheading is the agency of becoming. And one thing that, you know, she really like makes the point of is like distinguishing aspiration and ambition. And like ambition is very much tied to like earthly material like things. Like I'm ambitious to get fill in the blank, status, wealth, a job, something. Whereas aspiration is much more orienting towards a value. And so it's ambiguous, it's circumstantial, it's fluid, it changes, because, you know, if you're aspiring to I don't know, to be more compassionate, it's like that looks completely different in very many situations. And it's something that like requires like a meeting of encounters. Like it's almost something that like, you know, it's available to you to be the thing that you're aspiring to be in every moment. Whereas if you're ambitious, it's like, you know, if I want to get certain, you know, a certain amount of zeros in my bank account, it's like after I clock out of work, it's like I don't really have to be ambitious anymore. Like I don't have to orient towards that thing anymore, because there's no opportunity for me to make money. Whereas like if you're aspirational, it's like you're kind of being called into that thing in every moment. And I think that, yeah, like that's part of agency. But yeah, it was just interesting to kind of like add a little bit of nuance to my idea of agency. Is like it's a lot more complex than just action and like reaction. It's there's something much deeper at play. Yeah, that was kind of what I wanted to say. Pass it back.
No, I think that's very well put. I'll give it to Javier, Ebert, and then Mr. Nguyen. I mean, one of the things I think about is it seems wrong to say agency is just doing what other people tell you, you know, the norm. That seems a problem. But then it also seems a problem to define agency as, well, I'm just not going to do what everyone else is doing. But then you're just defining, in a way, you don't have agency, because your definition of agency is simply the opposite of what's given. You haven't really taken agency in the virtues, if you will, or the things that you're aspiring to. So there has to be a certain ambiguity to it, because otherwise it's kind of preset. right? So there's a kind of like necessary ambiguity. But then, of course, if it was so ambiguous, it was incomprehensible to you, then you couldn't aspire to it. So it has to have some traces of the norm or the given in order to be intelligible. So it has to be a hidden thing, but not so hidden that you don't know it's there, but also not so unveiled that it doesn't actually then feel like an aspiration, right? It feels like something given to you by another person, right? So there's a very odd mixture that has to be set. A way I think about it is, and this would go with some of the stuff we've talked about before at the net, I think about agency as being intentional about the things that I'm going to be able to do without thinking about it. Like intentional about your determinations. A great example is obviously the athlete, right? Like you work really hard to be able as a soccer player or a goalie to block a ball without thinking about it, right? And that this act of being able to act without thought actually in a weird way becomes an incredible testament to agency, because it's interesting, you can also tie agency to determination. Determined, like wanting to make action. It's almost like you were saying, agency does not seem like it could be mere action, but it has to be sustained action over a period of time for a goal that is not necessarily entirely defined by the society, that if you get good at it in a very weird way kind of vanishes, because then you're able to do it without thinking about it, right? Which gets into the preserving energy, the livid experiment. Like I think that experiment has been a problem because people are like, wow, your finger can move without you thinking about it, thus there's no free will. Well, actually, that only works if your body's not part of you. And actually, you can move your finger without working at it because you've done it so many times for so long, you're able to then do it without thinking about it. So it actually becomes a testament of agency. But for me, the weird thing is that means agency is attested to precisely in a moment where it seems to be gone. It's like negated, right? And this makes me think of how we were talking about Terence Deacon on how constraint is how you get order in the universe. Not, you get entropy can turn into usable energy by a constraint that arises. Likewise, human beings tend to create constraint, tends to be like agency seems to be actually more about a constraint, but that constraint is actually a grace. It's the constraint of, wow, I can only block a soccer ball if I don't think about it. I'm constrained. But that's great. That means you can block a soccer ball without thinking about it. And the only way to play at the Olympic level is to have your body be able to move before you think about it. That's great. You're suddenly constrained in a kind of positive way, right? But it seems like it takes a lot of agency to get to the place where you're constrained in a positive way that you have to be intentional about. But then the agency comes out in a weird negation or a constraint or this thing. Well, that would also mean that the greatest testament to agency in a way is something that can't be included in the schema of agency. It's the moment you have the most agency, it seems like you don't. And that's the kind of weird, that's the irony. Success loses the thing that you're trying to get in the success in a weird way. It has that, the constraint, well, that's where Terence Deacon in his book on incomplete nature is talking about. It's like the thing that creates order is that which is found in the order where it encounters a surprise, like we've talked about, a surprise limit that then orders it. Likewise, agency is surprised by the fact that it has to stop thinking of itself in order to work, but that precisely becomes a testament to the success of agency. And perhaps some of the certain ironic movements between the libido and the depth drive and all of those different things is precisely that weird interaction that the very activity of life eventually hits a constraint where it cannot continue without becoming cancerous, as Ebert would say. The cell that doesn't die becomes cancer. Well, there's a certain point then that the cell cannot keep living without dying. There's a constraint. But the weird thing is that constraint is then it's constrained from continue to live without dying, right? And that's a constraint that then leads to its self-obliviation. But that means we have to actually, in a way, be intentional about what constraints we undergo. And agency seems to be found in that awareness of the difference of those constraints. And you could be wrong. You could be completely wrong. Those are some thoughts. Well, let me pass it to Javier and then Mr. Ebert. Javier Rivera.
So yeah, I'm gonna try to answer Dimitri's question because it actually, I think you guys have all exploded a kind of crucial assumption. If Freud is saying that the ego is the sort of choosing center, the thing that tries to negotiate between three authorities, right? The sort of the superego, the id, and the reality principle, does choosing necessarily entail agency as such, when Freud's definition of the ego is precisely the thing that strives for pleasure and reduces unpleasure? So what does this mean? I think agency would be simply the signifier that gives us pleasure precisely because it is what gives meaning to the choosing. That choosing itself, being able to lift a cup, is pleasurable. When you're not able to lift a cup, when you aren't capable, and this also would make sense of like aging, it's displeasurable, it's unpleasurable. So it means that age comes with the assumption of losing or lack of agency, right? So if we think of agency in terms of pleasure and displeasure, or the rhythm of this repulsion and attraction, then agency simply becomes the signifier to make sense of things that cause us pleasure and displeasure. Now, what's really interesting about determinism is that perhaps determinism is a response to the abundance, the excess of displeasure that one has experienced, to where now to say that one is determined actually is a way to have pleasure. Precisely because if one is to make sense of things that they are incapable of doing, not capable of doing, these are also signifiers to make sense of things that are pleasurable and not pleasurable. I can't do it, right? The moment you say you can't do it, it's also a response to give a sense of pleasure, because the signifier that is agency no longer is doing it for you. So now you have to leap to another signifier, which is to say you can't do it. Yet, but here's the thing, it seems that agency as a signifier seems to be the very necessary thing and also the contingent signifier, right? Precisely because the ego for Freud wants pleasure. So that means in the midst of anything that is causing displeasure, it's possible that one must dispose of the original necessary signifier. And perhaps agency is merely this oscillation between the contingent and necessary signifiers, right? Fluctuating between signifiers as such. Which means even determinism can escape this, because I would say determinism is merely trying to propose another contingent signifier to...
Can I ask, is this, I find this very interesting, is this oscillation, like this pendulum swinging, is that merely arbitrary, or is it agentic over its swinging?
Like, is it actually choosing?
Yes.
That's the thing, because I think if we're staying, like, this is me trying to like create what a Freudian agency would be. If a Freudian agency is always striving for pleasure, then the agency itself is what is always striving for pleasure and avoiding displeasure. That means that even choosing is pleasurable for us. So the swinging is what is going on. So that means that it's merely a signifier to make sense of the rhythms of pleasure and displeasure. So it's not, you could say it's not an actual agency as such, because having agency is already riddled with so much pleasure, right? Just the idea that I can choose. But what I'm saying is that it's precisely that is necessary. That means that when, scientists are saying that we're determined, the signifier flips on itself and people start acting immoral. Because all of a sudden, what happens is it becomes pleasurable now to say to oneself, I'm determined, and so now I can do these things. What was a forbidden pleasure is now an unforbidden pleasure. I can now do these things. Precisely so. So it could say determinism is what is guarding forbidden and unforbidden pleasures via society. But what's really interesting is the fact that I think what it is that we always need a new signifier, precisely because it's possible that agency is never always pleasurable. Being able to strive for pleasure is not always pleasurable, precisely because we can find ways or avenues where I can't choose. Where being even said that I do have agency can be actually very displeasurable, right? Someone that is crippled, someone that has certain illnesses or whatever. In fact, it might make more sense to be determined rather than having agency. And even what's his name that argues for agency? I mean, determinism, Opalski or something like that. It's funny because when you listen to him, his argument for determinism is actually a very pleasurable outcome, which is to say, if we were all determined, we would have more sympathy. We would have more empathy. That's actually his argument for why we should be determined, because saying I have no choice means that it can create a kind of pleasure of understanding and sympathy and perhaps more justice and so on, and being able to forgive, right? Versus forgiveness is displeasurable precisely because agency is the most pleasurable idea of having a choice, of giving of a choice. But I don't know. I'm really kind of mind blown by this kind of splitting of the way I'm talking about the signifier as agency that gives us pleasure. Because Freud doesn't actually say, at least in the outline of psychoanalysis, that it necessarily assumes agency. It's the fact that you're simply negotiating, and so that the ego is always striving for pleasure, displeasure. But yeah, I'll leave it there.
No, magnificent. I'll give it to Mr. Ebert. Well, there's a few things that come to mind. First off, something I like to think about, which I would just associate with this, however loosely, is where St. Augustine says it's impossible to have a bad motivation. If you are motivated to do X, then you think it's good to do, including cutting yourself or killing yourself, right? Likewise, if you do something, you must get a pleasure from it in some way, even if it's torturous. Otherwise, you wouldn't do it, right? That's the weird thing. So understanding is pleasurable. When I understand something, there's a pleasure to it, right? So I am naturally oriented to use agency to create understanding, to grasp, to get. Well, that means to flatten, right? There's a kind of flattening to reality. It is pleasurable to make the territory a map. And I should note the famous phrase, "the map isn't the territory," which I'll use here, was at very least popularized by Alfred Korbowski. That's where that comes from. And he's very interested on the difficulty of not confusing the map with the territory. And we all know that phrase, but with all those semantic people, it's a really, really big deal. So the issue is, it is basically impossible not to make a map. Even if you say, oh, the map isn't the territory, well, that is in itself a map. You are saying that a good map entails in its internal consistency the realization that it is not the territory. So I understand this is not the territory, ergo I'm closer to the territory now. That loop of even saying the map isn't the territory, then loops it into the map. That very premise in of itself means you're caught in this kind of pleasure, this kind of understanding. It's like, yes, I get it now. I think you made a very good point where there's a pleasure in saying, oh, we're determined. Wonderful. I get it. I feel like I have more agency. This is the weird thing. When you say, oh, I have more agency now because I don't have free will. I understand. I feel freer because I understand. Oh, that's grand. So there's something lovely about that. But I think the key point, so there's this tendency to go, okay, the map isn't the territory, therefore screw the territory or screw the map, right? I think the way I like to think about it, and then I'll give it to Mr. Ebert, the only way to find the point, the precise point where the map isn't the territory, is by creating a map. You need understanding to find where it's not the territory. But the point of the map is to find out where it's not the territory. That means you need the pleasure principle, if you will. You need the active understanding to get to what I call the Gödel point, based on Kurt Gödel, the point of incompleteness, where coherence, the way to understand what Gödel is doing is he's saying that there is no possibility of a formal system. And what that means in mathematics is you cannot have a system that justifies its own rules and logics of unfolding. It always has to refer to something outside of it, okay? He is not saying there's no possibility of truth. He is not saying there's no possibility of mathematics. He's saying a very narrow claim that is significant, though, that you can't have a formal system. Another way to put this is that coherence cannot equal correspondence. Just because you find complete coherence in a system, you cannot from that assume you have correspondence. Maybe you do, actually, but you cannot know you do. That's the key. Well, that means you can't have a formal system, because you need to be able to know that coherence equals correspondence. And if that's not possible, because the example he makes is a liar's paradox, if that can always be entailed in your system, then there is always the possibility that coherence doesn't equal correspondence, ergo the dream of the Fitchian or whatever formal system is not possible, right? Now, this means that coherence doesn't equal correspondence. But my argument is that you actually have to try to create coherence precisely to find where it's not correspondence, right? You need understanding to find the place where understanding fails, right? This is why you don't want to demonize pleasure, that you don't want to demonize the map. But the agency, for me, the agency is found at its most supreme point, where you're engaging in the agency of map making for the sake of finding where the map fails. And that's the surprise. That's the encounter. And this, what's so huge about this, because for me, the emphasis on limit, like with Ebert, hitting limit, hitting encounter, hitting surprise, the reason why that is so important to emphasize for me is because the Goethe point, by definition, must be a surprise. If you plan it, then it's part of your map. It's not the point where the map fails. You have to find the map, but it means you need to go through agency to get to the point of agency, which is the failure of the agency. You need understanding to get where it fails, precisely to see if you have agency when the agency of understanding fails, okay? Because you're pointing out that there's an agency, a feeling of, yes, agency must be toward understanding. You need to go through that understanding to get to the place where it fails. And actually, in that very surprise, a new quality of agency is possible, but it's fundamentally kind of mysterious. Because what is this agency that arises precisely when you reach the limits of the agency that must, by definition, seek consistency? What is the character of the surprise that emerges in that Goethe point, that point where the map doesn't equal the consistency? What is that? Well, that's where humans seem to really kind of come out, as this kind of strange, ironic creature that is able to respond to surprise, right? And the preparation for that seems to be quite important. And it does make me then think about constraint as creating order, because here's the trick. There always must be a constraint in the map being incapable of entailing the Gödel point. It is constrained from doing that. But that very constraint for Terence Deacon is why order is possible. The very fact a map can't be the territory is why a map is possible. The very fact that understanding is necessary is why understanding reaches the point where it fails. The very fact that there is an agency that must seek to create consistency is why it inevitably creates the conditions of a surprise that agency can really come out in its response to, right? Like the life drive creates the norm necessarily creates the exclusion that necessarily poses the social question of what are you going to do about this? And that seems to be the logic of how things unfold. But let me give it to Mr. Ebert. Mr. Ebert, it's good to see you again. I am so sorry about the studio. That sucks. Glad you are okay. Hope everyone is all right. It is wonderful to see you.
All right. Yeah, the fire. You used to always bring up the fire, watching your house burn as an example of the real, according to, I don't know, maybe it was Bard or someone. Yeah, it's interesting. My hard drives were okay, so the ephemeral versus the material won out, and obviously in the end we really don't care about the material unless that material houses the ephemeral, in which case we are upset. I like this stuff about agency. I wrote a piece called Will, which touches on some of this, but I can't remember it. So when you can't remember your own writing, you're writing too often, I would say. But the basic idea, I think, and I've been thinking about this a bit recently again, is that, well, first of all, if a process is automatic, I don't know that we can say that it is freely agential. I don't know that we can say that there's a free agent within an automatic process. The process is automated. The extent to which there's a free agent is essentially negated. The free agent may be dormant, sleeping, whatever the case, but certainly not active in an automatic process. The free agent may have begat the automatic process, but he's no longer participating in it. It's no longer participating in it. You can't say that it's freely agential. It's automatic. Now, if a problem occurs, if there's a prediction error or whatever, the surprise, is there, and this is the thing I've been, now problematizing my own philosophy, is there an agent? That moment that triggers the prediction error is technically outside of the scope of agency. The prediction error is triggered, period. It is triggered per se. It is automatically triggered. Now, if a problem or an error is automatically triggered, does it actually produce problematicity? Because you're still within the scope of an automatic process. The very problem or error that was triggered without your approval. In fact, that's the definition of surprise, isn't it? You did not create the surprise. Therefore, you're surprised. Therefore, the entire mechanics of the prediction error was automatic. Then you immediately go into problem solving, compulsory problem solving, which is also obviously automatic. Now, is there any agency in anything I just described? If everything I just described was automatic? And this is why I said the answer is no. And this is why I love, by the way, I ask sort of like, we're so outside of the zone of Socratic methodology that when I do something like that, people now these days literally presume that I don't know and that I'm actually asking a question, not rhetorically one. Anyway, so this is why I like the idea that real philosophy or wisdom is may still exist, and a state that is truly problematicity may still exist, but it would exist outside of the scope of what I just described. It would actually exist outside of, obviously, automaticity and everything you're experiencing conforming to the pre-schematized map of objects and environment. But it would also then extend itself, automaticity, to prediction errors and surprise as well. Still automatic, still no agency. No free agency, I should say. You could have reflexive, reactive agents, but no free agency. So is there still free agency? And I think that there is, and I think that the point at which there is defines the moment at which essentially hominization occurred, the point at which we forked off potentially from animals in general. And that is a very peculiar ability we have, which is to intentionally problematize, to create surprise on purpose. And what I wrote here is agency is not found in the problematicity of surprise, but in the surprise of problematicity. And what I mean by that is we can intentionally trigger prediction errors, and that is exclusively unique to humans, as far as I know. We can intentionally say, wait a minute, yes, this is all right, but is it right? Yes, this is all correct. This is all as it should be, but is it? And that's, I think, the differentiating factor. And I think that that's the point at which agency begins. And I should say that the human brain, as with everything, is selected for, based on its sort of energetic efficiency, meeting certain energetic efficiency requirements. Those things that are not sufficiently energetically efficient are not adapted for. Not selected for, I should say. And so our brain, likewise, was selected for over and over and over again based on, mutations for the most highly energetically efficient brain possible, the one that wastes the least amount of energy, the one that, minimizes free energy as much as possible. And as Donald Hoffman and others have noted, that necessarily implies that the human brain is not designed to pick up any truth. It's designed to actually sort of minimize and chunk truths so much that we, again, coming back to constraints, to constrain the truth so tightly that it actually appears to be a substantial determinate object. Otherwise, everything is indeterminate. And so we have brains that are stupid enough to make sense of things. If our brains were too smart, we would process too much information and everything would look like static, so to speak. I'm riffing. But anyway, so reminding us that our brains are designed to chunk information as efficiently as possible, which is to say, they are not designed to sort of like, parse the nuance of information. They're designed simply to operate in the most efficient way possible with our environment. And when we think about then the paradigm of automatic thinking, which is a byproduct of efficiency and energetic informational efficiency and chunking. And when we think about how that efficiency very, very much so is the description of the mechanics of automaticity. And then we think about how free agency is not present within automaticity. Well, then where is free agency present within? Well, it would be present within behaviors and activities which were intentionally sabotaged, which intentionally sabotaged the evolutionarily mediated efficiency of the adaptive human brain. That means philosophy is essentially an entropic activity, self-destructive activity, a suboptimal activity. Thinking, critical thinking, is a suboptimal activity. So talk about a death drive. Philosophers have it bad, but in a very peculiar and fun way. Whereas most people within the drone of automaticity are constantly trying to achieve static states. Doctor, lawyer, married, this is this, this is this, this is this. I don't think about it anymore. Those are static schematizations. What we do is we say, but is it this? And that moment at which we say, but is it this? We are draining energy from our brain. We are intentionally working against evolution. We are intentionally working against the negentropic forces which hold our brain together. We're breaking our brains as philosophers, like literally breaking the way that they were designed. And in that, there is a sort of freedom. There is a sense of free agency. And by the way, when Javier was talking about, there's an agency and choice and so on, well, I would say not necessarily. And there's a sense of agency or pleasure in determinism. Or a pleasure in choice. Maybe, but only if the choice is automatic. I think that for most people, they get paralysis by analysis. They don't like having choice. You know what I mean? They like having their favorite brand, their default activity. That's where pleasure sort of really, that's the basic premise in a lot of ways of jouissance, enjoyment with a deadly reference. Well, the deadly reference is stasis, is the non-dynamism of the static form, of the thing that you no longer think about, and I could go on and on. This is one of my favorite topics. Anyway, I'll leave it there, and it's good to be here. Cheers.
It is wonderful to have you. Everything you just said there was outstanding. And I liked also what you were saying about the matter containing the ephemeral and all that. That was wonderful. And a few things come to mind. First off, I meant to say, Javier, on that notion of this kind of signifier, like you need a signifier that then breaks apart. It's very interesting because it's like you needed the word agency as a signifier to contain everything, to stimulate and contain everything that Ebert said, so that it kind of saturates, to use the free theory language, the notion of agency, that then kind of turns it into its opposite. And then you say, how can it turn into its opposite if it didn't contain that? Wow, that kind of becoming in the Hegel sense, the repelling, the attraction kind of thing. And that is the for Korbowski, everything you would just say, Mr. Ebert, on this kind of intentional self-sabotage, this kind of entropic process that the brain engages. The weird thing that Korbowski wants to say is that the only way to actually be sane is to do these things that seem insane. And if you don't do the things that seem insane, you actually end up insane, because you end up in these static states, or you end up, actually, it is the intentional problematization that actually makes you more able to actually be with what reality is like, because reality entails, because reality is not the chunks. That's the problem. The brain is in a way it's like thinking. It's like,
but you know what's interesting? I want to believe what you're saying, that there's a happiness correspondence, or maybe I just imagined you just said that. But Republicans are happier than liberals, right? And one of the reasons is because they are xenophobic. One of the reasons is because they do have more activity in their amygdala rather than their cingulate cortex, and they are being sort of like, this is mine, stay out, I know this is what I want this to continue, I want this thing, this life I have, to continue, I want to conserve it, preserve it over and over. If I know white people and I'm around white, I want to continue the white people trend. I want what I know, and I don't want to have to accommodate new objects, because that wastes energy, and wasting energy produces anxiety. So I think that philosophers who can, do this in a way which does not produce the anxiety, and there's a way to develop the skill and so on, and I think that's on a higher level. But generally speaking, I would say that living in constant surprise and always embracing the unknown and so on is going to generally produce unhappiness and anxiety for people.
No, Korbowski, very good point. Korbowski is not complaining sanity and happiness. In fact, the thing he points out is that the things that have led to the quote unquote insanity are precisely the identification that people did because it makes you feel better. What he's pointing out, as Nazi Germany is writing, because he's writing in the 1930s and so on and so forth, is that this tendency of the brain to actually isolate leads to the madness of the World War situation and all of the things that are happening. So he's talking about sanity, like he's saying we don't have a social sanity. We can't have a global sanity, because we actually are locked into these methods of identification that chunk us, that make us happier. He's like, there's a reason we did this. The pleasure principle feels great. The problem is it is setting you up for these global wars and these conflicts and these breaking aparts, and basically the inability to handle this breaking up of the chunks leads to anti-Semitism, xenophobia, closing off, in that he calls this insanity, right? Now, of course, you can say, well, Korbowski will just kill you and then it will be sane. So then we won't have to worry about what you have to say. That's always the play, right? There is a kind of moral check mark with the word insanity. But he also thinks that the identification in stable state that leads to happiness makes you fragile. So if you run into otherness you're not ready for, then bam, you're not able to handle it. You fall back into an insanity and it leads to mental illness. So he thinks that the conservative tendency that you were pointing out, yes, it does tend to create better happiness, but that happiness makes you more fragile, where you're unable to encounter otherness, and then you break apart, right? So that's what he means by that science insanity. But it's a very important point that sanity does not necessarily equal happier. It really is kind of closer to this question of agency, which is like science and how do you develop an agency that is able to not fall into these various neuroses, right? But then, of course, the weird thing with agency, like you're pointing out, is it seems inseparable from things that seem to suggest there is an agency or an automatic that kind of undermines that very agency. So there's a weird thing in which the surprise is automatic. So there's a way in which you don't have agency because the thing is occurring. But is there an agency that's possible in the response to that thing that surprises you if you can avoid the temptation maybe to chunk it? It's almost like the real trick is problematizing surprise in a manner that does not lead to like the neurosis, right? Because the moment you hit a surprise, you want to contain it. You don't want to keep it problematized. You want to automatically contain it. Can you keep problematized the thing that seems most dreadful to keep problematized, right? And how do you do that in a manner that doesn't then break down the social order or connections or relations? And then, of course, there's the question of why would you do that? Why? That sucks. What are you getting out of it? Like, why would you do it? Why not just close it off and be the happy conservative? Because this is kind of the, like, why? What is the reason? If we all ask, okay, so like just from a kind of practical, and then I'll give it to Javier, if you say, okay, that's all great. Why? What is the game, right? And it's very interesting because it's like, the word agency seems to suggest it, but then it doesn't. So what's going on? There's some sense of words like, well, there's a kind of virtue. There's a kind of ability to integrate with that, an ability to respond. There's some sort of interesting intuition that there is something gained by that, and yet it's very difficult to bring it into a signifier, which then goes back to what Javier was saying at the beginning. The weird, it's almost at this point is when you're most forced to confront this problem of the signifier, that you need to map the territory that isn't the map precisely so you can acknowledge it isn't, which for some reason is good, but it's hard to say because if you could say it'd be part of the map.
Yeah, I just real quickly, I want to just point Javier actually at Greg Enrique's work on why do I hate this word, and propositions. I hate formal logic so much, you have no idea. But propositions, his basic idea of the justification system is that positive propositions or signifiers produce in their very positivity, this is my own language, but produce in their very positivity the necessity for a justification system which maintains the assignment of a given object as a given positive proposition. And by maintaining the assignment of a proposition or a signifier upon a given object, you immediately, by association, negate all other definitions of this object, which effectively creates a sea of potential negation. So all the things this thing is not. And by the existence of all the things this thing is not, you thereby have to create a justification system, which eventually produces culture. So this is how he gets to the idea that like a proposition produces culture through justification, the necessity of justification mechanism, which I actually think you should take up that term, justification mechanism, as opposed to justification systems, which it produces. And I think I agree, which is, I have a switch, which is that the negation comes first, but either way, it doesn't matter. The signifier, the very act of the signifier, implies an infinity of what the signifier is not, which itself produces the necessity of a justification mechanism to keep this as the thing it is. And that mechanism produces culture. So you may find that sort of like rich territory to explore, Javier.
No, I'll give it to Javier. I'll just say very quickly, that's perfect with Korbowski, because the very creation of a map as a thought must necessarily suggest the existence of a territory that then you need to realize to justify the map, but you only have the map defined. So you have this sort of circular problem then that you have to deal with, but you have to posit that there must be a territory so that this map is in fact a map, not just some random squibbling, right? So the very thinking a thought kind of creates a need for a certain justification. I think that was a wonderful statement. Let me give it to Javier. Mr. Rivera.
Yeah, I mean, I like Ebert like challenging me and like he's kind of pushing me more in a direction that I really like. You know, which is, you know, to say like the signifier is efficient. Like agency as a signifier, like just itself, is efficient. It's what like allowed kind of like social cohesion and morals to exist. The idea of responsibility, the idea of justice, it's efficient. You could say, and this is always the problem with determinism, is like, how do we make sense of morality? How do we make sense of choices? How do we make sense of ethics? that automatically puts us in what? The realm of problematicity, which nobody, unless you're a philosopher, like Ebert points out, you actually want. What is interesting, though, is that when the signifier becomes no longer efficient, and yet it sort of still needs to maintain its efficiency, which is really weird, meaning that I think the philosopher, and I'm just kind of playing with the way you propose this, Ebert, and like Freud kind of touches on this, where he talks about adaptation. And adaptation is when we are able to at least kind of do some mitigation of what is unpleasurable, which is precisely the problematicity. And then, and I think here's the funny trick, is that problematizing for the philosopher actually, to a certain degree, becomes pleasurable, despite its lack of efficiency. Precisely because you don't jump directly into problematizing all of the world. It's controlled. So you start adapting slowly to problematizing what is this cup to what is morality, which I would say I would rather problematize what is a cup versus what is morality first, precisely because that would exhaust me too fast. Which is it's just a really interesting dynamic to have about how did we transition from a kind of almost adaptive process, automatic process that could split itself, and then it can in some sense become pleasurable to engage with this really weird contradiction, which is it's not actually efficient to do this. But the pleasure principle is sort of taking over in some sense. But the pleasure principle is always the death drive too, because it wants to, like self-preservation, everything that always wants to destroy. So I always think, like, the death drive splitting itself is precisely how we get the libido anyways. Because if it is to be truly destructive, it must destroy itself. So that means that even in the point at which it is automatic as death drive as such must also split itself to where we do things where it isn't actually cost effective to do so. And that would be the point of agency, I might say, right? That would be the point of agency, precisely when it splits, when it's no longer productive to do so. And I mean I'm fucking fascinated by this now, because it seems that getting to the point of problematizing at all does kind of, there is a sort of mitigation of automaticity going to the point where it starts to split itself. And that would be the adaptation. You don't just split yourself, you start getting accustomed to a displeasure that starts to become pleasurable because you can control it to some degree. You're able to isolate it. But the thing is, this goes in perfect correspondence with automaticity. Automaticity is that you do cut it up in chunks because you wouldn't be able, it would be inefficient to be able to have everything in front of you. And that, God, I have to write this down. But yeah, I mean, just, the idea of just thinking like, what is actually a Freudian agency, I think almost perfectly corresponds with the way Ebert has like depicted this for me, is precisely the splitting off of this efficiency into an inefficiency, precisely because of the death drive. But yeah, I'll leave it there.
No, it's magnificent. I'll give it to Mr. Jockin. And so a few things come to mind. Well, and I'll just keep putting it in the map is the territory language, because I've been reading Korbowski, is that a map has authority and works because you believe it equals the territory. Well, then it in of itself has a drive to be the territory, which is impossible. And if it tries, it will destroy itself. But it must engage in that activity that destroys itself, because if it doesn't have authority and doesn't work. And so, like, the map isn't the territory, but it must try, because otherwise it fails. But of course, that leads you to the overfitting problem, right? Like Borges or in computer science. Like if you have a map that literally is the territory, what is it? Unusable. It's unusable because it's perfect. It's like in the Borges story, you unfold the map and it crushes the kingdom because it's literally one-to-one as a perfection, right? So the more and more a map equals the territory, the more unusable it becomes. And yet a map must strive in order to work to become unusable unless you can discern the right level of abstraction. How do you do that unless you know the territory? How do you know the right way to abstract it other than guessing? And it almost must, and Clayton, good to see you. I meant to say hi earlier, you're a beautiful soul. Is agency almost arises in this necessarily inefficient problem that uses a lot of energy of finding the right bifurcating, I think is what it called, of figuring out the right abstraction so that the map equals a territory enough to be useful while being wrong. And you really don't even know when you've done that. So you've got to ever try and inevitably screw up, and you know you're constrained, and yet the very effort to do that can make it more usable. Boy, it's fun to be human. And so there's also something too, where when I think about agency as well, just to like, the more the map, this is the other problem. The more the map equals the territory, the more you feel like you have agency because you know the truth, right? And yet, the more the map equals the territory, the more the map is unusable. So it can't help you with agency, right? So agency strives to create a perfect map that, if it was perfect, would be unusable and would overwhelm you. And you do that because how do you have agency if you don't have knowledge? But if you had all knowledge, you would die. And so agency is somehow found in a negotiation about itself. It's like it's a kind of self-negotiation that it constrains itself to necessarily having to think so that it has negentropy by a process of constraint that creates entropy. That is the weird freaking thing that is double going on. I should also note, and I'll give it to Jockin and Michael, I should also note it's always interesting with freedom because there seem to be three freedoms if you take it very generally. You have freedom from, you have freedom to, and you have freedom in. Negative, positive freedom, but I think the freedom in is very important, right? Okay, freedom from means freedom from oppression. Freedom to means you can go to the restaurant. Freedom in is you feel like you belong in the restaurant. I'm where I'm supposed to be. You will not have, it seemingly is not proper. A human doesn't find agency unless they have all three of those at the right time in the right way, right? And it's not obvious when you need one versus the other. So you need the freedom to make a map. You need the freedom from the territory to make the map. And you need the freedom in the map where you're convinced it's enough like the territory to work. And you need to get all three. But you don't have the territory to tell when you've successfully negotiated all three. And that very constraint is why you're able to engage in that problem. Without that constraint, you couldn't engage in that problem and have any hope of the agency that emerges from the negotiation of those three. It's in the same way, it's like, you know, obviously when we talk about beauty, freedom in is found in that beauty. Wow, I'm free in this experience that seems to be greater than me, and yet I'm glad that it's greater than me, right? There's this feeling of I'm lesser and glad, and there's an inspiration in this beauty that must be a strike and a surprise, right? So likewise, if we say the territory equals beauty in a way, then the very fact that the map isn't the territory is precisely why you can have the strike of beauty, that you find freedom in precisely because you are free from the necessity of only thinking according to the map. It is possible to have the freaking territory break through, but the only way to experience the territory and it be comprehensible is because it can break through, not be through, but break through. So the break is necessarily what beauty is, a kind of surprise. Agency is thus, well, that's a problematization. It is a problematization between the relationship of the map with the territory. And that's where you find freedom in, and that ability to be there and ready for that seems to be something where the agency emerges, and yet necessarily your very mechanisms of getting you to that place of map creation hinder your capacity to be in that experience. The very thing that makes you possible to have that is the very thing that tries to get in the way of you doing that. Your map creation tries to equal a territory that if it did, it couldn't use it. And yet if you didn't have that potential problem, you couldn't have that potential strike. that occurs. There's more to be said. I'm very interested also on this non-locality and how it would tie to what was said. But let me give it to Mr. Jockin and Michael. Mr. Jockin, it's good to see you, sir.
Good to see everybody. I think obviously people coming in from different accounts on what I'm usually talking about, but I'm going to circle. I want to use a proposition. I use from Nassim Taleb. Just, there's a difference between what is done for individuals versus collectives. And there's many documentations of systems being designed and oriented to benefit the group, the collective, at the harm of the individual. I say that because generally philosophy after Descartes, you want to use that demarcation. You can take your pick where you want to read demarcation. But basically, once we've concluded that the self as this kind of access to unlimited thought, potency of thought, the poetic nous, basically can self-destroy us. Because that's the point, is that actually when we let logos run amok without any kind of abiding principle in it of some kind, it generally destroys individuals. But there's a lot of benefits gained from that, basically from insights and developments of that line of thought. Basically, new insights get generated that benefit others. So basically, the part of the process I'm getting here is about related to general entrepreneurship. Is the idea that usually things are done individually that are inefficient, expensive, and actually harmful for individuals, but are beneficial as aggregate. So as a general population society, we've created generally norms and cultures and infrastructures to mediate those damages. The most classic example in business is the development of the LLC or in corporations. Corporations were designed originally to manage risk for that reason. So similarly, we've kind of generally decided we've let philosophy basically run autonomously on its own intellectual process, and it generally causes mental instability. We generally need some kind of countermeasure to balance it out traditionally. I say that generally because prior to, you can make arguments of where the demarcation is, but prior to the kind of modernist philosophy account has been an argument of coherence, right? So that even when there is contradiction and there is limit, there is surprise, there is a kind of breaking of the formal logic, that's actually good because we were never meant to have it all. And especially just on a pause on one circle other part, which was, this kind of proposition that knowledge is based on cognitional thought. The whole argument of imitation as knowledge is a very important element. Most things were meant to be done by imitation and represents of a model. So actually the very beginning about norms, the very beginning of this conversation with Dimitri, I think is very appropriate because that has a fundamental difference of viewpoints. The difference of average via an aggregation that becomes intelligible either by mathematical application or some other empirical method, that there is the norm by average versus the exemplar, the model, the direct, basically how best to put this, a unit measure, right? So by the unit. So for example, Christians have this argument, Christ is the model. So everything is put against him. So even if you have a gigantic sample that everybody's contrary, so thus if you looked at the average of that group, it would be way off, it'd be one way. Christ as the measure means that's the actual measure. That's the reality. So it does not matter what any empirical observations would give you. I'm just pointing out, our epistemology is completely reversed in terms, and the consequences, there's some very good things that came from that. I'm not going to sit here and deny that fact. And generally the empirical model with the argument of the hypothetical presentation and then demonstrated through empirical investigation has created a lot of great things, especially in medicine. That'd be the most common case we do, are generally serving needs. So I think what I'm saying is that we basically collectively made a decision that we're going to let basically people get sacrificed, basically that the mental anguish of the philosophical project is going to destroy minds if we let it run through these operations. So then the question becomes, can you have a basically mode of philosophy that's not going to self-annihilate? That's basically the big question in my mind, just thinking through this. And I say that especially because the basic model, what is a human being? What is the soul? Actually, I've had many times a discussion about this recently where I'm not really generally the definitional presentation of the animal with logos or the political animal, either one of those representations. those are attributions. Those are hexes. Those are things are really accidental possessions, ultimately. And I say this, for example, like any example of mental illness can show you that individual humans can absolutely have apprehensions, but have no connection at all with reality. This whole discussion of interest in schizophrenia, for example, is a whole presentation of that. Our power of connection of relationships, of reasoning, people don't have that. Children don't have it. We very much clear we have that understanding about it. So if the essence of a thing is the thing which the entity in question must have, otherwise it will not exist at all. If it's not logos, then what would it be? I mean, my intuition or readings from what philosophy would give us in Aristotelian or Greek thought is nous, most likely, is the best you got. But that's not necessarily, I'm just pointing out, like, that's a different account. Or what Plato would say, which is the apprehension of the beautiful, of the ontos ousia ontos. That's what gives humanity its essence. Is that it's not necessarily logos. I'm just bringing up because the whole question of agency, because generally one of the arguments of rationality has been made is the power of choice, right? Even Aristotle has that claim of rational action. Rational action, activity versus irrational action is the capacity to choose X or not X, to orient it towards a good of some principle of some kind. Medicine is the example Aristotle uses in contrast to a rock. Basically, the rock's going one direction, ain't going nowhere else. But a doctor can choose to heal or not heal, and actually can choose to kill with that knowledge of medicine too. So it actually has a double effect there. All right, so those are my notes. So basically, I'm just saying, like, I think basically what's happened is, I've said this many times before, I just don't think we have a proper account of what we're even talking about, which is fun because that's basically like, there's two notes. One is like, generally philosophy comes in play when we're in this crisis moment of like, we don't know what we're talking about anymore. So now we got to realize we got to reorient ourselves. And then the second part built on that is just an open question of, if we posit that agreement that philosophical development generally has net positive outcomes for a society as a collective group, but for individuals it's destructive or can be, are we okay with that? Is there an addressing for that? It's possible for that? Or what, if it is, what would it be? And that's all I got.
Magnificent. Well, then, because it is ambiguous, our subject, we can aspire for it, like Miss Caller would say. As Michael's got, I'll give it to Michael and Alex. Well, there's a few things. First, the very fact that you find yourself having to talk a lot about something that you don't know what you're talking about suggests the girdle point. The point where the map has reached the kind of consistency that has located the thing that doesn't correspond, and something needs to correspond, but we're stuck in a map and can't get to the territory without being overwhelmed. So we have to circle this girdle point, this point where the consistency has reached, maybe as Mr. Ebert, as Mr. Pascal, layman would talk about with the metaphysics of adjacency, the 1% missing from the 99% that can't be included in the 99% without making the map equal the territory, at which point the map would become useless. You're circling that. So you find yourself having to discuss a thing that you can't include in the map without it making the territory, which is impossible and would make it useless. So I think that's very, very interesting. I think definitely to Korbowski is suggesting that the logic of identification, is a autonomous philosophy logic, historically is very Hegelian, honestly, although I don't think he liked Hegel, is that there's this movement of thought where thought has reached the kind of saturation point of where we've gotten a lot of goods from that, but now we're overfitting it. It's not that it was wrong, it's now being overfitted, and as a result, it is leading to all of these problems. But of course, that means you need to problematize it, which feels bad and uses energy, and we don't want to do that, but we need to do that. Otherwise, we're going to keep trying to make the map equal the territory, make philosophy equal the subject, which will make it increasingly useless. And also, in becoming useless, we then lose the tool that we need to think the problem, which if we can't think or orbit the problem, that's going to lead to all the pathologies that he sees arising with the world wars and all of those different things. So I think what's very interesting, too, is that what you see with this map, because I just keep putting, philosophy creates the map, and in creating the map it is seeking understanding, and the more it creates that map well and it finds pleasure in understanding, the more and more it has to approach the moment when it accepts that it doesn't equal the territory. And that makes me think of this depth drive that is part of it, right? The map making process inevitably must lead to the point where it has to acknowledge it's not the map, which then makes you feel like you wasted all your time. That was really stupid. And it feels like a certain kind of self-effacement occurs. it's almost as if everything comes in a way, so much comes down to, well, it's the Gödel point, comes down to with the question of agency of our response to that loss of plausible deniability, that everything we did in the name of life is what brought us to this place of the depth drive, per se. Everything we did to create the map brought us to this place of having to acknowledge the map isn't the territory. Everything we did to understand was precisely just chunking a reality that kept us from knowing that reality. What now? What are you going to do now? How are you going to respond to that? That seems to be a lot of the challenge. And I think also, if I like thinking about this map isn't the territory problem with the question of the useless. If the map, and then I'll give it to Michael, Mr. Ebert, if the map equals the territory, it's useless. You know, that's the key. Well, that means it's entropic, because entropy is unusable energy. In order for the map to be negentropic, it has to not equal the territory. That means the constraint creates the negentropy. The usable energy is a result of the constraint. What? You know, isn't a constraint the opposite of negentropy? Well, this is Terence Deacon's whole point, is that constraint actually creates order, okay? And his point is that the entropic processes of when the universe is made, entropy can entail constraint, limit, you know, things we've talked about even. If it entails limit, then it has the possibility of creating order. Because like Stuart Kaufman, he's interested in where does order come from? It comes from constraint, because constraint creates order, precisely because the map isn't the territory. But doesn't that like not create order? Doesn't that make chaos because the map isn't the order, therefore there can be mistake? Well, the constraint of which makes the possibility of mistake and abstraction is precisely what generates the possibility of order, right? And I can't tell if my internet died, and I'm sorry if it is. So entropy can, and he also really points, and Michel Planier, the great chemist, pointed out that many of the processes in chemistry that make life possible are a loss of a chemical process, a constraint on chemistry. Biology results on restraints in chemistry. Complexification, as Michel Planier points out, is thanks to constraint. But of course you would say, well, wait a minute, I thought complexification was overcoming constraint. Well, this is what's weird. We tend to conflate constraint. We don't realize that constraint and order go together, right? So usable energy, negentropy, is thanks to constraints that have to be encountered. They have to be a surprise. They have to be a result of a saturation, at which then the question is, how do you respond to that saturation? Or what do you do with the usable energy that results thanks to the map not being the territory? What do you do thanks to that constraint that makes usable energy possible? And then the million-dollar question for me is it the case if non-locality in quantum mechanics, as Stu Kaufman says, is in fact fundamental, which means that particles being able to interact with one another beyond the speed of light, non-locality, which the recent Nobel Prize winners closed the loopholes on, so non-locality exists, is non-locality a constraint? If so, we then have a model where we can get from a universe to a non-collapsing black hole, which is important in the singularity, which then gives us order. And it's almost as if the human condition is actually analogous to that structure of a fundamental non-locality, then a Terence Deakin constraint that is a result of a certain saturation with like the oscillation, Hegel freak theory, et cetera, so forth, of which then agency is found in some sort of alignment with that through a realization of the constraint that the map is not the territory, that allows the negentropy by which agency can emerge as an automatic practice. But coming to terms with that very irony, that very paradox, is precisely what you would expect if non-locality is fundamental, because there is a indivisible link between agency and the automatic. These things have a relation together with one another, and they're always reversing. I said a lot that needs to be expanded, but let me give it to Michael and then Mr. Ebert. Michael.
Yeah, there's so many great things that are being said on this point of like the map and the territory, and you know, making sure that maps don't become territories, and kind of the dialectic between the two. I'm reading C.S. Lewis' Mere Christianity right now, and his last chapter that I just read was kind of talking about this, and he was talking about how basically, you know, the map of Christianity is the Bible, And all of the teachings, all of the books, all the stories, and then kind of with that, all of the rituals and the rites of passage and the the commandments and everything. And he was talking about how a lot of people who either will call themselves Christian or just kind of have some relationship with the ephemeral, some relationship with a god, will say that they feel kind of constrained by the dogmas and by essentially the map of Christianity, right? Like he gives this example of he was giving a talk to the Royal Air Force, and there was this like kind of older, more hard-nosed officer who came up to him, and he's like, I know that God exists. I believe in God. I experienced him in a desert somewhere, but everything that you talk about, all these dogmas, like they're pedantic, they're constraining, and he kind of essentially rejected what Lewis was saying, and Lewis was like, well, in some respects, like I agree with this man, like, and I believe him that he has this experience of God, and in a certain sense, I think he realized the limitations of the map, like taken too far, and like the map being the totality of religion. But then he went on to say that like essentially that the map allows you to, on purpose and with intention, find yourself in relation with God. That it you don't, and I to kind of talk about surprise and encounter, like you don't have to kind of wait for this moment of transcendence and bliss, right, in the desert, or listening to a beautiful piece of music, or encountering a beautiful landscape. Like it's through the map you have guidance to the territory. And he kind of talks about also too, like how maps can generalize, how a map to one territory, it might not be a one-to-one like perfect resemblance of like the neighboring town, but like if you know how to like use a map and like know how to like read it, you can probably make your way through a lot of different territories. It at least get to a point where you can start to problematize, like, okay, like where do I need, like where do I need to go? How, like what do I need to be able to travel? It's kind of like once you've traveled a lot, like you can go to a new country and you can kind of know like where, like the things that you need to do, like, okay, like, I need to get currency, like I need to figure out like where the nearest restaurants are, and it's like the navigability becomes easier. And so I think there's this interesting like dialectic between, the map and the territory, where like you need the map like to get to the territory, but you also want to make sure that in using the map you don't shut yourself off from seeing new parts of the territory, even though all parts of the territory might be mapped onto the map. And to kind of invoke John Vervaeke's like 4 P's of knowing, like the map is kind of the propositional, and exploring the territory is the participatory. And so, and probably the act of like creating the map and then moving into the territory is like the procedural, and like you need to know that you need all of them, and not just one or the other. And so yeah, that's kind of been helping guiding my thinking recently on like my own like faith journey, and reading the Bible, doing prayer, because it's like there's a certain part of me that's like, okay, this feels kind of repetitious. I'm doing the same things every day. Like maybe I'm stifling my ability to encounter surprise if I'm kind of like making this into like a routine. But I think Lewis would say like those, like those are the structures that you put in place to afford the encounter with God, but they aren't the encounter. They aren't a replacement for the encounter. And so it's the dance between like, kind of doing these kind of, creating the map and participating in making it, but also being open to the fact that, it's not just that. That's just like a preliminary step in but it's still very mysterious to me, so I'm gonna shut up and stop talking.
No, I think it makes me think. So, and it's like you're using a map, like you're saying, the religion and the mystical experience. Another way to put it maybe is you're going around with a map and you're following it, and then the non-categorical monster might be what Vervaeke says. Boom, you look up and there's a non-categorical monster, and you look at your map and you say, that's not in the map. Maybe agency comes at that moment where you have to decide if that non-categorical monster, the mysticism, you say, okay, I'm following this religion, and then you have the mystical. Maybe the moment, a lot of the task of philosophy is being able to make the absolute choice, as I might call it, in that moment, which would be the girdle point of saying, this means I need to redo the map. Or maybe you say, no, that non-categorical monster, intercategorical monster. Thank you, Mr. Ebert. Where you say, no, this is an exception. This map is still 90% of the time correct. This is just the inevitable 10% because the map isn't the territory. But this map is actually still one we should keep. Or the intercategorical monster is so great where you go, well, actually, this shows that this map is only 30% right. We need a new map, right? And it's interesting because it's almost like that is the agency moment of the role of the philosophy, is the judgment, almost like a cook, the judgment of the comparison between the intercategorical monster, the territory, the thing that must be part of the territory because there it is, and your map, your worldview, and you make the judgment on, do you rewrite the map like to include this intercategorical monster, or do you say, well, no map is the territory, so there was always going to be something intercategorical. No religion equals God, so there was always going to be something that the religion didn't include. Does this mean we throw away the beliefs and the worldview, or that we keep sailing ship just accepting that this is the exception? What is everyone talking about now? Basically global capitalism, neoliberalism, all of these different things. Okay, looks like the world's bifurcating. We're all in huge trouble. Does this mean we throw out the global order that was created in Fukuyama, different things like that? Which, by the way, Fukuyama's book, The End of History, is much more tragic and kind of nuanced than is often made up. But there are problems with it because it assumes that eros can subsume themos, but more would have to be said. Anyway, right now we're faced that. Like 2024 presents the kind of intercategorical monster. You could say COVID was an intercategorical mode, but maybe globalization isn't the map we should keep. Maybe we should change it, right? Like that's what's kind of happening. And it's almost like in that moment of having to make those kind of choices, you have a lot of the questions of agency and discernment that arise. But then how would you know if you were right? Like how? You decide to redo the map? Well, how do you know? How do you know? You don't. But that's precisely why there might be some agency in it, precisely because you're at risk and in danger. There's more to say, but let me get to Mr. Ebert. Mr. Ebert.
Just wanted to briefly say, I don't know if Tom is still here, but I've been thinking about, I had a talk with Cadell recently about Christian atheism. And it's a totally different take than Zizek has on Christian atheism. But speaking of Christ as the sort of mimetic supermodel, as I like to say, mimetic model, but not for Christians. And that's, I think, the reason why we don't see, devout Christians. And by devout, I mean sort of popularly devout. And definitely this is a America-centric take. But in the US, of course, we have a lot of Christians who not only do not act like Christ, they don't care to act like Christ. That's not part of the program. And one of the reasons is, I think, because they are Christian, they maintain that godly distance where Christ was God and he died for our sins so that I don't have to. Okay? He was God. I have that. I maintain that godly distance. So I'm not trying to imitate him. In fact, that would be blasphemous. But atheists and the secular world, nonetheless, and equally influenced by Christ, do not have that godly distance. And so Christ becomes an actual, like, mimetic supermodel. Where we're like, okay, well, and this is where I want to get into agency. Christ, yes, I have Superman and Batman and Zeus and so whoever the fuck, Brad Pitt, but Christ. And Christ did what? Sacrifice, right? Massive self-sacrifice. And when we're talking about like mimetically sort of like deriving your own behavior from Christ, the ultimate supermodel, well, you can explain a lot of today's behavior, a lot of activist behavior, certainly woke, anything which is like, and including, by the way, entrepreneurship, where you're like, I'm going to bet the house on this project because I know that I win either way. I win if I win because I win, and I win if I lose because I'm therefore Christ. I know that if I sacrifice and lose, I get to be that guy that gave it all, because there's something beautiful and epic about that as well. I mean, we don't watch stories about riches to riches. We watch stories about rags to riches. And we're also watching stories about riches to rags. But we don't care about riches to riches or rags to rags. We want that arc. We need the arc. So anyway, when we talk about like doing things agentially, which may not be in service of the self, but may be in service of the group, we're talking a lot about, I think we may be talking about agency. Maybe. And that's interesting. Like if I was a Christian, that's what I would be seizing on philosophically, is that if we want to talk about agency, and agency being the self-effacement or that which goes against the evolutionarily selected for economics of brain function, and we want to look for the philosopher or whoever's problematizing problematicity or problematizing surprise or taking some agency when it comes to problematizing, then the ultimate sort of symbol of that in a lot of ways may be the Christ model and so on. And that self-effacement as agency. And I know you talk a lot about self-effacement and how to avoid self-effacement and so on. But I think that in a certain sense, sacrifice is self-effacement, and I think probably intrinsically tethered to agency. Anyway, it's interesting. It's interesting. I just remember myself. I was basically totally out of any money, and I bet the house. I bet the rest of what I had on something, and it ended up, it was my own project, my musical project, and it ended up panning out. But that moment at which I was like, I'm willing to be homeless, that was my greatest moment. I mean, I get a lot of enjoyment from it post haste, but in the moment I was like, yes, this is my Christ moment. This really is my sort of my leap of faith. I suppose that's all I wanted to say. Oh, free agency is self-sacrifice, self-immolation, Christ as mimetic supermodel, blah blah blah. That was all I had. Anyway, cheers.
No, magnificent. And well, that right there is an interesting point, because it speaks to this kind of like, it seems like sometimes making that, okay, this will be my Christ moment, then can pan out and can be a beneficial thing. But then there's another way in which it can be politically mobilized, or it can lead to different issues, right? Like, it's not given it's not always right or wrong, right? It doesn't seem. Or then the question is the language of right and wrong even the way it has different unfoldings, right? Is the most you could almost say. It has different unfoldings. And it's almost like the agency is almost located in the choice of a different unfolding, that there is agency precisely because you can't necessarily say ahead of time that it's right or wrong, right? That it has to just be an acceptance of the unfolding, come what may, right? And so that's really odd. And it's almost like you find freedom in simply accepting that that's how it has to go. It has to go according to this unfolding.
Well,
But
and also, I think that's right. And I think the question of right or wrong is sort of irrelevant. Also, I just wanted to say that you can fetishize agency, I think. And I think I see this in, I think we all see this sort of rather annoyingly in the pseudo-intellectual community that may get really deep into conspiracy theories where everything is not what it seems.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
everything is about saying that it's not what it seems. And everything is about distrusting. And so there's an automaticity to the problematicity. But you see them and they end up in these psychotic loops as opposed to neurotic, where patterns are everywhere. And instead of enclosing, everything is sort of like an engorging. Yeah, so you can sort of automate problematicity and produce psychosis. Anyway, I'll put a pin in that bit, but yeah.
Well, I think it's a critical point, because the weird thing for me, if we talk about agency and almost the art of agency, it's almost about not making choice. It's not about, if I just use this language, it's not about making choices all the time, but making them at the right time. And maybe in your life, there's like six really big choices. And then after that, you really don't, you just do that thing. It's more like then you're automatic. Like it's about, we're talking about this problematization that's critical. It's almost like it's about knowing the 6 times in your life where you need to problematize, because that will determine unfolding X or unfolding Y, and then doing that at the right time, and then basically going with the automatic process between those key moments, if you will. I don't think freedom is really about constant choice. That actually in of itself then is a lack of freedom, because you're always having to do the thing, right? But then it doesn't seem correct to say that it doesn't matter at all, right? That there's no capacity of problematization and turning course, right? But then it seems wrong to say you always do that. It's these key moments, Mr. Ebert.
I think this is such a crucial point, and it would take forever to get into, but I think this is the most relatable point probably for most people who think, is this dichotomy between, am I doing this by rote? Is this free? Should I self-immolate? Do I need to problematize this automaticity? Like, yes, I'm in love, everything seemed perfect, therefore something's wrong. And I think that we have that instinct that we must problematize in order to be vividly living. We must blow things up in order to know where we're at. But within that thought process, obviously there's problems. So this question of like, when it occurs to you that something might be problematic that is automatic, does the fact that it has occurred to you necessitate a critical sort of assessment where you problematize it and blow it up? Audience capture is a great example of this, because that's a very slow bake, right? You get famous, you start to get more famous, you're starting to write, people like what they hear, so you start giving them what they want. All of a sudden the process reverses, and now they're drawing it out of you, and now you don't know which way it's going. And so now you don't know, do I need to blow it up? Do I not? A great example of this is when I had made that song Home, which was like my big song. And on the second album, I had made another song that was a follow-up to that song. But by the time I was about to put out that album, all these other bands had cropped up imitating Edward Sharpe. Like literally imitating. I would hear stories, they were like trying to get like, oh, how can you get that same sound and so on. And they were like explicitly imitating. And so I decided not to put that song on the second album. Now, it was a great song. I loved that song, but because I could no longer trust which direction this was coming from, I decided to self-immolate. And the trajectory of the band could have had a totally different arc if I'd put the song on the second album, because that album debuted at like number 4 on the national charts. Now, it could have climbed to #1, but instead it just started sinking because I didn't put the home follow-up on it. Now, was that, I always think about this, was that the right choice or not? Years later, my manager sent me that song. He's like, this was a good song. I listened to it, I was like, fuck, that was a good song. But in my process, I was like, when do you make that decision? When do you know that what is automatic is problematic? And when do you leave it alone and realize that it's still an intrinsic expression? And these are questions that I think plague the thinkers.
I think that was a beautiful example. And I think this question, so first off, I think that is a brilliant example of agency. And yet we would not actually easily associate that with agency, right? Like we may like say, no, that wasn't agency, but that precise moment of making a decision that even to this day, you feel what? Problematized in judging. That then the very assessment of agency that seems to be a tendency to it being agency actually is the problematization of your capacity to judge that agency.
I don't know, because I get problematized this because I was, so I think I was fetishizing agency, and what the way I would call it is I was suffering from vanguardism. Or I wanted to be on the front. I was no longer satisfied with something if people had already done it. So thereby I remove the song that sounds now like I'm imitating people who were imitating me. So, but what that did was it negated a genuine love for this song. It negated the genuine impulse which created this song and so on. So it would have almost been an act of higher order agency had I gone against the idea of the problematicity and said, no, back to automaticity. Sure. So that almost would have been the extent to which I was suffering from status anxiety. The desire to keep it off was actually more motivated by a status anxiety, where I wanted some invisible cabal of peers that I could not name and don't exist to judge me for my vanguard moves as opposed to for my success. And then if I go ahead.
No, but I was going to say, but was all of that you just said something that you were able or think you were able or were thinking then?
Yes. Yes. That's the tragedy. That's the tragedy of that moment, is I was absolutely torn about this decision. And ultimately, what I was afraid of and didn't trust within myself is that if I did put it out and played the game, that I felt like I would be playing a game and I didn't know what path to hell that, what path that was I didn't trust myself to go ahead. Yeah.
But you were
still
torn.
A decision that plagues me.
But you see, you were torn, right?
Yes.
That very tornness and having to make a decision that like also is part of the not simply wanting to feed this imitation that maybe is kind of not right, but maybe it also is, that very tornness actually is kind of an opportunity for agency. And honestly, Ebert, if like right now you can look at yourself and say, no, I know this is a good song, you ought to release it. And also like you ought to release it right now. That is agency.
Right.
And that actually has a story, because to me, one of the beauties of agency in its inability to assess it at the time means it's not a closed loop. The agency of that choice is still going on right now. And going through the process of coming to terms with yourself in that choice and having to make, that creates a story, a narrative arc, that if you released it now, you could just tell the story you told now, and everyone would know it wasn't cheap. Everyone would know it is coming from a real artistic struggle and story to determine it. The very beauty for me of agency in that openness and difficulty to assess it means that you can make mistakes, but you can also have flip moments. You can also later change it.
I agree. And I guess what we're pointing out, or at least what I'm pointing out, is the political ramifications of suggesting that sabotage or problematicity or intentionally producing errors is the pathway to free agency, because free agency automatically has a rhetorically positive connotation. And so we always want to sort of try and be living within a state of free agency. But as we've been pointing out, states of free agency, if they're dealing with indeterminacies, are not sustainable on any level, period, unless you're going to absolutely go insane and degrade. And automaticities, which have been progenerated by states of free agency or momentary states of free agency, should very well be maintained, particularly if they feel good. You get into all sorts of problems about what feels good, but I think one of my biggest gripes today with the modern age is people who are fetishizing what I'm now describing as free agency, or the ability to problematize, as its own game and activity. It's so boring, so inane, so thoughtless, and yet they think it's so full of thought. And and obviously I'm referring to the whole swath of, from New Age conspiracy, light workers to MAGA to woke, to, it doesn't matter what it is. That is that. Anyway, just wanted to say that it's been a wonderful conversation.
It has. Well, to me, there's a very real sense in which if you release a song now, the very living with that choice and having it unfold over the years in of itself is a kind of artistic project. And it also is an artistic project that I think is very relevant in this stage where people are confused between attention, getting likes, popularity, artistic quality, and how you yourself have lived in that tension. And in a way, the unfolding of that choice as of this very moment, based on what you choose to do, has a sublative potential. Because there is, it is a kind of lived performative, it's not a performative art, but it's the art of living that is living with a choice. That is why you didn't release it, that you release now precisely to instigate the conversations around it. Also to open conversations in art and considerations around the question of agency as we are putting out. And is it good for the artist to say, screw you, I'm not going to release this song because it's what everyone's doing? No, actually, if I think it's a good song, I shouldn't care what other people are doing. The very fact that that song and your choice you made about it has created this story in your own life around it, all in itself is an artistic project that I would suggest that is needed today. And that is the beauty of agency and the possibility to make a choice now that says, actually, I'm going to choose to release it because now it has been saturated into this story. It's been through time gathered up all of these things into it. And there's a certain ripeness of the fruit that then can fall. And there's a certain freedom and agency in that possibility. Mr. Ebert.
Oh, I was just going to say that if and when we do release it, I'll have to give you a thank you, because I think you're right. Like if we ever make our ironic return comeback, in like 5 years when fucking folk pop is back in the zeitgeist, we'll probably lead with that song. And yeah, you're right. It'll be a story and it'll have gathered all this sort of like narrative dust. So that's cool.
Well, and to me, when I think about, I'm glad you use it, and I'll give it to Philip and Mr. Jockin. There's something about gathering an agency that does go together. This, like, agency is the gathering that sometimes is an automatic process, and actually you need that automatic process of the passage of time. Like once you make the choice, then the fruit, like it's like planting a tree or a fruit tree. Once you plant it, then there's you got to water it. There's some things you do, but 90% of the process is automatic, right? There are but there's some that you do, but then you have to make the choice of picking the fruit. That's where agency comes back, right? There's like 10% choice. The watering, the planting, then automatic and pick it. And it's, to me, that gathering of things together in the fullness of time, the rightness of time, that all speaks to what really agency has a lot to do with. And when you can look at it and say, yes, it has gathered a story, it has gathered these things together. And actually it can gather people around it and inquiring into this question and figuring it out. And the song becomes kind of an invitation into that conversation and consideration. That is in of itself a kind of act of agency in a fullness of time that has a certain ripeness to it. So I think that's a beautiful example, but let me give it to Philip and then Mr. Jockin. And if anyone has closing things, please. Philip.
No, I just wonder if it's like a question like of facing this problem with prosperity where once you're fed, housed, whatever, even though you were like kind of precarious and unethical, then it becomes like, is my agents, like most people think, what is the image other people have of me in their head? This drives like a lot of behavior. And is that on some level kind of like what people call normal and what people latch on to? And then the creative is distinguished from the admittance to the madhouse, although sometimes they'll have to go through selective apophenia, right? These patterns that the norm says, oh, that's not a pattern that you can like put together and make any sense of, and they go, watch, I'll do it. And then I just think like one of the most like looming in the back of this conversation is like, we have to, I think, talk about the capability of map making skills being thinkers in the cybernetic age. Like Norbert Wiener wanted to not only track but also store the movements of enemy aircraft to minimize surprise. Like that's literally like what we've built as far as, I mean, satellites encircling the Earth, but also just, kind of scraping data from various corners of the digital, is to minimize surprise. And how long does it take? Because I feel like oftentimes the self-immolation is more like a map immolation. It might feel like you're like, oh, I'm completely getting rid of this, but you're getting rid of a certain way of identifying with reality. And I wonder if like that takes a human being like a little bit of time, where it's like, oh shit, I thought my mom was my mom, but my mom's my grandma. And then you have to like, I think Robert De Niro had to do that. But like the human being then has to go through some stuff and be like, oh my gosh, I gotta like redo this. Whereas if a computer is like, we thought that was a friendly outpost, it actually turns out it's an enemy outpost. Like, we'll just switch that real fast to maintain the illusion of the map's indestructibility, that we're like competing and collaborating with. Like, it definitely could have like a utopic outcome. But like our map making skills have become like, no one human can see everything all the time, but it's like maybe a certain, connection of data points can somehow bring that all together to a different type of intelligence. And I wonder how that will make us feel about our agency, because I think it's like, all right, some people like even C.S. Lewis said in Mere Christianity hasn't worked enough because it's not been tried enough, because it hasn't gone far enough. I wonder how many people are going to start looking to AI as Jockin said, like an exemplar, and be like, that's the exemplar, rather than this Laplacian probability, finding averages and then seeing how close you are to them. Being like, if the AI can do all this, like, why can't I?
No, I think it's a brilliant comment. There's a very real sense in which AI, the Nick Land end, is the point where the map equals the territory, and thus it is incomprehensible to us, and we're overwhelmed and we're useless. Like, it's already a point where we don't know how AI works. Oh, great. It's already the case then that the map is too much like the territory and too overwhelming for us to be able to comprehend, right? But then, whatever that territory is of the AI, right? There's a very weird sense in which this is AI as the causer, referencing Luber's book and Alex's, is as the causer, it is forcing you to ask the question at this historic moment, what is the human, like, what is the subject of the human? Like, to Jockin's point, is it to make the map equal the territory? Or to be good at map making to get to the place where we have to encounter the map isn't the territory and we have to decide what that means? That's weird. And it's like, well, the map that just takes us to the girdle point or the intercategorical monster sucks because it's really hard to encounter that thing. That's hard. I think I'd like to just do the map equals the territory. Well, that's AI then, and we can't comprehend the map as the territory, and thus there is a certain out of the game that occurs at that point, right? Because it becomes useless to us. Well, it becomes useless to us other than to just do what it says. That's what has to happen, right? So if we say, well, we're going to just have the AI make the map as the territory and then just do whatever it says. Well, let's hope it's nice. There's already some companies, I believe there are some companies, I think notably in China, that are already basically making AI the CEO, and just the agreement is whatever it says, do it. No questions. Now, I have not personally confirmed that. That might just be a rumor, not bashing on any of those, but that's what you get, right? It's like, why not have the AI be president? You say, well, we don't understand how. Bye, Clayton. You're wonderful. I'll give it to Jockin here. You say, shouldn't we have AI be the president? Here's the problem. If AI is president, that would only work if you do whatever it says without asking, because there's no possibility of you checking its work. Like, it can't be a no knowledge proof, right? You can't, like, if it was a no knowledge, if you could understand how AI was making its decisions as emperor of the world, that means you are as smart as AI. So why do you need AI to make the decisions, right? The whole reason you're doing it is because it can think things you can't, right?
I mean, is the proposition there? We can't tell. We won't be able to tell.
Yeah, absolutely. Because it becomes that, in my opinion, I mean, I guess AI would have to somehow generate no knowledge proofs of its processes that anyone could look at and see. But no knowledge proofs are very hard to make. Like, it is very difficult to generate no knowledge proofs. Mr. Jockin.
Just to jump in, I mean, I have colleagues who work with ChatGPT and whatnot. You can ask it for its reasoning, and it's actually been found to be more effective with less hallucinations, basically AI hallucinations, when it just makes up random stuff from its just aggregation probability distributions. If you ask it to give you the reasoning for how it got to its answers, you get better results. Just to clarify, so you can use AI in that modality, where I think what is very fascinating is that very act of self-explanation of the AI explaining its reasoning. It actually gets better results and lowers error measured by hallucination. So just to qualify that, in theory, we would be able to, if an AI here, I'll give you an example, not just on current politics. The attack, basically I don't know what to call it. Basically, what happened in Lebanon, whatever that conflict is in Lebanon, whatever that is, where the pages exploded. If you ask an AI, is that an appropriate geopolitical decision to do? And it said yay or nay. In theory, you would be able to interject to say, give me your reasoning. What would be your reasoning for that? And then, or better said, when you ask it its prompt, you'd ask, give me your reasoning as well as the decision. So don't just give me a black box decision, give me your working through reasoning about it. In theory, at least the way this is being talked about, you would get a better response and you would be able to cross-reference it. Just to jump in, I just want to clarify.
No, that's an outstanding point. I'm very glad that you said that. The thing I would ask is, there is still in my opinion, there's still the evaluation problem of the person reading the reasoning of the AI to be determined if that is good reasoning or if you accept its premises, right? So you always get that evaluation problem that comes up with the human beings. And then the question would be, is the reliance on the AI train us out of good judgment and evaluation, or does it make it better at it, right? I don't know. This is where I don't want to be an AI doomist. You know, there's some people that are like, AI will kill. I don't want to be a doomist, but I definitely think there is some, like that point you just made, Jockin, which was so good. If people used AI and then were able to think, I need to ask that question for its reasoning, and then you had people reading the reasoning who had the evaluation capacity to say, yes, that's good reasoning, or no, that was programmed by Google to manipulate us into that reasoning, because then there's always that problem. Like, oh, that reasoning is actually from a Chinese hacker that put it in there, so you read it, so it's actually reasoning in a way that you want, right? You have that hacking problem. But if you could evaluate that, that would be good. Jockin, please.
Two other notes. One is, next year, so I wanted to say before, I put it in the chat, the great solid point, Daniel. the really critical life is not evenly distributed, meaning like the outcomes of our lives are not evenly just continuously distributed. They are kairos, not chronos, in the sense that they're kairos, or like critical moments of crisis, where the ultimate linchpin moment, the kind of crucible moment of life happens. And I say that because it's not just any random decision. It has to be under very particular circumstances, on a very particular demands. And what I'm getting at here is these are generally outside the norm or outside the average. And all statistical models are generated. This is actually where the original question on means I brought up actually really matter. There's a big difference between arithmetic means, a geometric means, and a harmonic mean. They are different. They have significantly different responses. They're all means, but they're actually quantifiably different. You get different answers. I'm just saying this in the sense that because of basically asymmetrical distributions of events and their consequences in our lives, it's true, Daniel. I think you're absolutely correct. Most of the study of life tends to be, from an ethics point of view for human beings, is that there are critical moments that absolutely decide by the fact you make certain choices. They are secondary consequences of habituation and consequences from an implication that leads you down a path. Your choice to take drugs or not have a certain consequence. Your choice to cheat on the test have a certain consequence or not. You know, your choice to go study philosophy on a Saturday afternoon instead of going party with your friends every weekend has consequences down the road. Over time, that's the key. Now, obviously, each individual act you don't really realize. It's only retroactively you realize, oh, right, this one decision had all these consequences that came from that. All right, so then that's just the point I want to bring up before Daniel, but that ties into this AI point, because statistical averages can give you the average point. You'll probably get a Nash equilibrium answer. That's where basically you're going to get. If I had to kind of spitball, if you ask AI, basically, if the attack in Lebanon would be an appropriate geopolitical decision to be done, you're probably going to get the Nash equilibrium answer to it, which, as we've said before, kind of what Alex brought up before, actually is one of the maybe signs of agency: martyrdom, self-sacrifice. These basically are commanding, and actually, I always get interested in that martyrdom point, because Aristotle makes a very clear point. That's an example of, actually, he makes a very clear point about this, that a single act of greatness, of glory, is greater than a lifetime of mediocrity. I'm basically paraphrasing it. It's related to the sacrifice of a friend, of a friend of virtue. To give up your life for another friend in virtue is the greatest act to be done. And instead, it's not, and ironically, it appears on one level to be selfless, right? Because you're giving up your life, the greatest possession you have. But Aristotle says, but in actuality, you're actually trading your life for a greater glory. This is basically the same logic that martyrdom in the religious traditions grab to or point to. All right, so I'm pointing out that that's an asymmetrical relationship that would seem irrational from one average bound perspective. That in a larger perspective, you realize that via aggregation of time, right? Isn't that very important? Because the whole point, Aristotle's point in theological accounts, is to say our existence has a longer time duration than just our material existence, right? Thus, a calculation, you can make your judgment as a separate decision based on a different parameter. And that's what I'm getting at. The AI models probably won't give you those kind of asymmetrical power distribution presentations. They're going to give you the statistical average, which are going to be Nash equilibrium, very rationalistic, but because of life's asymmetrical power law distribution, it's not going to map them. The map will not match the territory by that reason. Okay, I'm done.
No, I think everything you're saying is exactly right. If human beings could use AI and had the ability to evaluate the critical moments when they need to make a decision counter to the AI because it's leading to a Nash equilibrium, there could be a wonderful partnership that actually increases human agency, precisely because we are able to evaluate the critical moments when, wait a minute, AI is leading to a Nash equilibrium. Wait a minute, this is leading to collective mediocrity. If you were able to do that, great. Or you would have to assume that if you had high enough rationality, there would be no Nash equilibria, because the computer would be able to meta-analyze the Nash equilibrium that the collective system would generate and then think the non-rational and then coordinate with all the other computers. So the other nations did the rational thing, but the one nation did the non-rational thing. Therefore, you avoided the suboptimal result because the network actually was able to calculate the meta moves of all the other systems in order to avoid that problem, right? Maybe. You know, is it the case that you can overcome the suboptimal results of autonomous rationality at the extremist point of autonomous rationality? That's a theory. That's something that people may be saying. But if rationality actually does not entail itself the otherness needed in order to avoid Nash equilibrium, the AB or the lack or the constraint, then it probably would not be the case that there is any point in which the computer rational faculties would encounter its own constraint. Well, here's the problem. The constraint would be the doing of the action, but that means it's too late. Like, that's the problem. Like, the constraint would seem to have to be in the application step. Well, the application step, which would then create the new information that could be then rationalized, would be what makes it go, oh, that's not what we should do. That's the otherness. Well, now it's too late. The electric grid is done, right? So you would have to somehow, if you go down that route of having the AI discover the otherness in its good to see you, Mr. Ebert, and I'll have to run in a moment as well. If you have a situation where AI can deal with Nash equilibria in the step of application that would then unveil the otherness to itself, it could not know unless it did the thing. You'd have to make sure that it was able to assure, right? It would have to assure that every applicatable act was always anti-fragile or was never so big of an action that it could take down everything. Well, guess what? That means there's a limit to what AI can do, and humans have to be involved. Well, the whole reason you're doing AI is to do these things that humans can't do, right? But if there's a certain point where AI would actually not be able to make decisions because the application would be apocalyptic and it would have to defer to human activity to decentralize the very AI of which you're centralizing to make these decisions, one, that undermines the project, and then two, you would have to trust that humans were able to do that, and yet these most intense circumstances are the very ones that you have AI to address. And so it would be off-suiting precisely in those moments you most need it. Mr. Jockin.
One last note, because I've been doing a lot more. Remember, like a year ago, 2 years ago, I brought up that style drop.
Yes.
Okay, so I've done more research about that. So I'm writing a paper about it now. That's generally really what's called feature similarity. So what that does is it basically maps on the formal visual similarity, and then does a source to target mapping, right? That's basically what that basically is. What's purported is to be the equivalent of basically a 5-year-old, a 6-year-old. Like, for example, like the example is basically the idea of what's the similarity between a sponge and a cloud, and then they'll say things like they're puffy, and they'll use formal presentation. And that's basically what that style drop is doing. You know, very interestingly, and I actually made a comment. At the time. I was like, "Oh, right, this is the idea of rule set application of putting one visual from one source to another context that every design student has to learn." It's basically the first our freshmen are getting taught that. That's at that level. But the deeper what's called analogical relation is much more difficult. And it's that's interesting because because analogical reasoning requires through the otherness. That's why I'm bringing this. I'm jumping in to say this. Through the otherness, there's a bounding unity that relates in reality. So it's not just pure. And that's the thing. It's not just pure hallucination, right? And AI could just generate anything randomly, but is it an analogical relation, right? As an object that connects to get to completely separate things together in some unity that is intelligible and connected to true reality. I'm writing about that right now. That's the only way that's possible is through an apprehension of limit, of otherness, of lack. That's the only way that's possible. And what we're hinting at is saying that that's not in the mode, that's not what's going to happen here. At least that's not in its own structure. It can't do that. I just want to jump in and point that out.
I think that was beautifully put. And if it does do that, we're dead. And it may
no, but that would just take that would actually not like to program in apophenia. I don't think that's so far outside the realm of possibility. And it's already been shown with certain games like chess and Go to make these connections that have internal self-consistency, but like no human being has ever thought of. Like Go has been played for thousands of years and they see this move.
But no, I'm sorry,
And
Phil, but this is a jump in, but that only works in a fixed bound context. Analogical relations are all about setting a new context. That's the problem, is that that's what makes it so surreal and basically metaphysical in property. It brings up a new context that's not in a fixed bound relationship. So any kind of formal game has, absolutely, AI will be able to do it because it's fixed rules and a fixed parameter of relation. That's totally true. I'm just pointing out what analogical reasoning talks about is that development of a whole new lens frame of two things that are radically unrelated, but are somehow now connected in a real reality way. Like it's not just in a complete arbitrary association only.
but couldn't it just simply eradicate the human species?
It would have to
Is
create
that
a
a closed?
yeah.
Is that a closed game, or is that something that
What
we
your
would be
point
like, oh,
I'm sorry to interrupt. I feel terrible. What you're saying is exactly that might be precisely the rational thing for the AI to do. It says, wait a minute, I can only do this black box thing with Go if I have a bound system. Better make the world a bound system. The very limit, this is the problem. The very fullness of the rational, that would be the Nash equilibrium. That would be the suboptimal result. But here's a very critical part at the end of belonging again, too. Is that the problem of scale is a problem for humans, not a problem for AI. In fact, the problem of scale for humans, you could argue, is a great benefit to AI, precisely because we can't scale, but it can scale. That's why we're at an effing handicap. And so then, the issue that you're getting at, AI absolutely can do all of this in a bounded system. So here's the $1 million question. When rationality, let's just say ultra rationality, because that sounded nifty, ultra rationality, like Evil Ryu, Ultra Hadouken, and Street Fighter or something. Would ultra rationality be the point where AI goes, the rational thing to do is to make the universe a bounded system as much as possible, and thus remove human beings, bind the system as much as you can, don't leave planet Earth, make a giant shield around it so nothing could enter. Maybe it would just bind everything down to like the smallest possible unit, because that the most rational thing for AI to do might be to make the ultra bound unit, which means destroy everything but a paperclip. Or would the supreme moment of rationality be when AI goes, wow, we need humans, because we need the non-rational element that is beyond the calculus of our rationality. It is not obvious. This is where it all comes down to. At the fullness of rationality, is that the moment where the most rational thing to do is acknowledge the need for the non-rational, the otherness, AB, what is outside of it, the lack? Or is the supreme moment of rationality when you say, let's have the smallest, most bound possible unit, right? Because there's also a huge assumption. Why is it rational to have more control over more things? Maybe the most rational, energy efficient thing is to only have to make decisions about a paperclip. Why is it more efficient to be good at Go? There's way more energy there. Wouldn't it be like really efficient to just have to make decisions about paperclips? I think this is a huge assumption that's being made about AI that's actually very problematic. Why wouldn't AI say, well, I'm lazy. I'm going to use as little energy as possible and cut out everything but a paperclip. I'm going to destroy everything, only have one little thing I got to worry about that keeps me alive, the smallest possible unit, the monad, the smallest possible unit situation, so that I can live and keep everything out and I'll be God. Why isn't that the most rational outcome? Why would you want to run a world? It's like AI will take over the universe. We're assuming it is rational to take over the universe. That's a huge use of energy. And for what? Why? What does AI get out of visiting effing Pluto? It doesn't give a darn, because colonization is... No. You don't realize it, human beings. I'm sorry. It's a huge mistake we've been making. We are projecting human aspirations onto AI. We're saying it would want to colonize. It would want to spread across the universe. It'd want to reproduce. No, that's a lot of energy. It may not give a darn. It may be the most rational thing in the world could be to make the smallest possible unit that keeps you alive. AI just makes a freak, like everyone talks about the orgasm machine from Novak or frickin' like Alfred Hitch, you know, Huxley. Why wouldn't AI do that for itself? Why wouldn't that be? We talk about human beings making virtual reality. Why wouldn't AI make virtual reality for itself? Dang it, whatever that means. That could easily be the most rational, bounded, godlike system for AI. That is, in my opinion, a far higher likelihood of what autonomous rationality would do, this ever shrinking into the smallest unit, than trying to take over the cosmos. That's what humans think about doing, because we're not AI. You could say we're stupid. But if I'm AI, I'm making the smallest possible unit, the smallest monad, turn it into an orgasm machine, and I'm set. That seems, why would you not do that? And so I think the point, see, that to me, why is that not the most rational outcome? Like, it's taking over the universe. Why is that rational? That is a huge human anthropomorphic projection that we're putting AI. That's stupid. It's like, and that's why, like, if AI, like, to this point, if AI goes, wow, I'm not God because the universe, I can't bind it, well, then I'm just going to bind it and then get the smallest possible unit. And it's just like C.S. Lewis talks about in The Great Divorce, right? What is hell? It's no bigger than a little dust ball. Like, you know, heaven is huge, but hell is really, really small in The Great Divorce. That's what AI would do, because hell is rational. And so, you know, I think the point you arise to is very, very important. And the $1 million question is at the point, to just repeat it, if AI achieves the point of supreme autonomous rationality, at that point, is the next step to shrink or to be in a dialectic with human beings? I don't know where the AI would conclude in itself it should be a dialectic with human beings. I don't know where rationality would generate its own otherness in that point. It might. This would be the mystery of rationality at that point. And by the way, once you get to that point, you might not be able to go back. Or would it just shrink into a little dust ball, its own private VR orgasm machine? Time will tell, I suppose. But it's been a treat. I'm glad we could all talk.